Chapter 1. The Isle and the Two Seas. There is no rush here. Nothing in the hours ahead will ask anything of you. There is no test at the end of this story. No need to hold every name. No need even to stay awake. If sleep comes, let it come. The story will keep. We are going back a very long way, before any king, any castle, any charter worth the name, to an island off the northwestern edge of a vast continent, shaped by forces that will govern everything this whole story has to say about crowns, conquest, and the long, unfinished argument over who gets to wear one. Settle in, let the day go, and let the story of the Isle begin. Picture, first, the shape of the thing. An island, modest by the standards of continents, divided loosely into a gentler, richer south and east, and a harder, wetter, more mountainous north and west. Chalk downs rolling in long green waves across the southern counties. Broad river valleys draining toward a coastline bitten everywhere by natural harbors. And, further north and west, hills climbing steadily toward the genuine highlands of Wales and Scotland. Lands this story will meet again, and not always kindly. This series has walked, in other tellings, countries whose very shape seemed to forbid unity. A Greek world of 100 jealous valleys, walled off from each other by mountains too steep to cross easily. A Japan of narrow, isolated plains separated by folded, forested ridgelines. This island is not that kind of country, and that difference is the first and most important fact this whole series will ask the listener to carry forward. England's own heartland, the lowland south and east, where nearly every king this story will name eventually built his power, is comparatively open. No mountain range divides it against itself. No single valley is more than a few days' travel from the next. The land itself, in other words, made a single durable crown a realistic project here, in a way it rarely was for other lands this project has told before. Call this the first of the series' 4 companions, the Isle. Its openness will not make this story peaceful. Very little that follows is peaceful. But it will make the prize worth fighting for a genuinely singular one. Not 100 small crowns, as in 100 small valleys, but one crown worth killing and dying for precisely because there is, in the end, only the one. And around the whole of it, water. Not a single connecting sea threading 1,000 cooperating shores, as this project has described elsewhere, and not a sea that mostly closes a door and keeps a world apart, as it has described elsewhere still. This island's water does both at once, and this series' second companion, the Channel, and the wider seas around the rest of this coastline, will spend the whole of this story doing both jobs in turn, sometimes within the same generation. At its narrowest crossing, a traveler on a clear day can see the opposite shore, and across the centuries this series is about to walk through, that narrow crossing will carry, in turn, Roman legions, Anglo-Saxon settlers, Scandinavian raiders, Norman conquerors, and the armies and revenues of an English crown that will, for well over a century of this story, rule more of the land on the far side of that water than any king based there ever managed to hold himself. The Channel is not a wall. It is a hinge, swinging open at the moments this whole story's plot depends on. And this series will ask the listener to watch it swing again and again, from this first chapter to its very last. We may picture a settlement in one of the river valleys of the gentler south, long before any of the names in this series existed, call it 4,000 years ago, in the deep prehistory before even the earliest chapters of the story proper begin. A household works fields cut from woodland on the chalk's thin, workable soil, cattle grazing the open downland above the valley, a track worn into the turf leading toward a distant hilltop enclosure where, once or twice a year, people from several such valleys gather for exchange, for marriage, for whatever passed in that world, for shared decision-making among neighbors who otherwise kept mostly to themselves. In the evening, from the valley's low ridge, the household can see on a clear day the smoke of other settlements in other valleys, near enough to visit, near enough to marry into, near enough in time to quarrel with. And this series asks the listener to notice, in that simple fact, the whole geographic argument of its opening chapter already at work. A country of neighbors close enough to become, eventually and with great difficulty, one thing rather than a country of valleys so thoroughly divided that oneness was never a realistic ambition at all. Nothing here is destined. This series has said as much at the opening of every land it has ever described, and it says it again now with the same seriousness. Geography is not fate, only a strong and repeated suggestion, made by the shape of the ground itself, generation after generation, to the people living on it. What this particular shape suggested, gently rolling, largely unbarriered, ringed by a sea that opens as often as it closes, is a single crown, contested with a violence this series will not soften, but a single crown nonetheless, worth every one of the wars this whole story is about to tell. Rest a moment more in the quiet valley, if you like, before the story turns to the first power that will ever try, seriously and at scale, to make that single crown its own. An empire from across the sea, arriving not as raiders but as governors, and staying on this island's southern and eastern lowlands for the better part of 4 centuries. The legions are coming, and this series' next chapter watches them leave. Chapter 2. The legions leave. Listeners of this narrator's Roman road will recognize immediately where this chapter's story begins, and this series flags the connection openly, because it is not a coincidence of narration, but a fact of history itself. This island's southern and eastern lowlands were, for the better part of 4 centuries, a province of the very empire that other story told in full. Britannia, garrisoned, taxed, and governed from towns whose Roman names still echo, faintly, in the English ones that replaced them. Its roads still traceable in stretches of the modern road network. Its villas scattered across the same chalk downs and river valleys this series described in its opening chapter. This chapter does not retell that empire's story. It watches its western edge, at the empire's own moment of crisis, quietly, then suddenly, let go. By the early years of the 5th century after Christ, the Roman world already straining under pressures this narrator's Roman road described at length, the frontier armies of the Rhine and Danube overwhelmed, the imperial center itself increasingly unable to spare troops or money for a province at the very edge of its reach. Britannia's own garrison was progressively withdrawn to defend more pressing fronts, until, in the year historians conventionally give as 410, more than 16 centuries ago, the Roman emperor of the day, according to the one brief and much argued over source that survives, told the cities of Britain to see to their own defense, because Rome itself had none to spare them. This series will not overstate what that single sentence meant in the moment. Roman administration in Britain had likely already been unraveling for years before any formal word arrived, and it is entirely possible the famous rescript addressed a different Britain or a different Britannia than the one this island housed. The honest, hedged uncertainty this whole series will carry into every corner of this chapter. What can be said with more confidence is the shape of what followed. Within a generation or two, the coined economy, the town councils, the villa estates, and the whole administrative apparatus this narrator's Roman road once described in its prime faded from the archaeological record with a speed that still surprises historians who study comparable frontier withdrawals elsewhere in the empire's collapse. Into the vacuum came new arrivals, and this series must be honest, from this chapter's first mention of them, about how contested the details of their coming actually are. Sometime across the 5th and 6th centuries, Germanic-speaking peoples from the North Sea coast of the continent, the source's own later tradition names Angles, Saxons, and Jutes among them, though modern archaeology suggests a messier, more gradual process of migration, settlement, and cultural adoption than any single wave of invasion, began arriving on Britain's eastern shores in numbers sufficient to reshape the island's language, its material culture, and eventually its political map entirely. Whether this happened primarily through violent conquest, through gradual settlement and intermarriage with the existing British population, or through some combination the archaeological record cannot cleanly separate, remains a genuinely live question among specialists, and this series will hold it exactly there, genuinely live, rather than pretend the matter is settled. What is not contested is the outcome. Within 2 centuries of the legion's withdrawal, the island's southern and eastern lowlands were speaking a Germanic tongue, worshipping Germanic gods, and organizing themselves under warrior kings with no claim whatsoever to Roman office. While the western and northern fringes, Wales, the southwest, parts of the north, remained substantially in the hands of Britons who had inherited, however thinly, Rome's own Christian and Latin-tinged culture, and who would carry a very different history forward from this same island's opposite edges. It is into precisely this uncertain, contested, poorly documented gap, a native British resistance to the incoming settlers, somewhere in the late 5th or early 6th century, that this series must now introduce the legend the whole island's later imagination would seize upon, weigh honestly, and set carefully aside. A figure the later tradition calls Arthur, a British war leader credited with a string of victories that briefly checked the Anglo-Saxon advance, appears first, faintly, in sources written centuries after any such victories could have occurred, and grows, across the following centuries of retelling, into the fully realized king of chivalric romance the modern world inherited. The sword, the round table, the wizard, the doomed love triangle, almost none of which has any claim on the 5th or 6th century at all. This series will say what it has said of every comparably legendary figure in its other tellings. The ground beneath the legend, if it exists at all, is a single obscure war leader in a chaotic, poorly recorded age, and everything the world actually remembers about Arthur was built, layer by layer, by storytellers working centuries, and even a full millennium after any historical kernel could have lived. This series opens that frame here, deliberately early, and will close it fully in its own final chapters. Because Arthur, whatever he was or wasn't, belongs to this island's mythology of kingship in a way this whole series' central question cannot simply walk past. We may picture, instead of any single legendary battle, an ordinary transition at the level this series always prefers. A British farming family, in the decades after the Legion's departure, watching the world their grandparents had known change around them, without any single dramatic mourning marking the shift. The coins their grandfather once used for market trade have grown scarce, and then vanished from daily use entirely. Replaced by barter and by whatever new arrangements the collapse of a money economy always forces on the people living through it. The nearby town, once a modest but functioning administrative center with its forum and its bathhouse, has grown quieter year by year, its public buildings unrepaired, its population drifting toward subsistence farming on the land around its shrinking walls. And, in the most recent seasons, new neighbors have begun appearing along the coast and up the river valleys. Farmers themselves, in the main, speaking an unfamiliar tongue, worshipping unfamiliar gods, settling land the family's own community can no longer easily contest. There is no single battle in this scene, no burning town, no last stand. Only the slow, generational give of one world into the shape of the next, which is how most of history actually happens. This series has learned across every land it has told. However much the legends that follow prefer a cleaner story. By the 6th century's end, the shape of what would become England was already visible in outline, if not yet in name. A patchwork of small Anglo-Saxon kingdoms across the lowland south and east, jostling, warring, and occasionally submitting to one another's overlordship in shifting patterns. This series' next chapter will trace only in broad strokes, because the individual kings of this earliest period are, for this series' purposes, precisely the kind of minor figures Rule G exists to dissolve. What matters more than any one of their names is what arrives, in this same period, from an entirely different direction. Not conquest this time, but conversion, carried by missionaries rather than armies, and destined to give this whole patchwork of small warring kingdoms something no king alone had yet managed to give them: a single shared faith, reaching, for the first time since the legions left, across every one of their borders at once. That faith, and the small kingdoms it slowly stitched together, is the next chapter's whole subject. Rest a moment, if you like, at the edge of this quiet transition. The legions are gone. The villas are fading into farmland, and a new people has made this island's lowlands its own. What comes next will give them, for the first time, something to hold in common. Chapter 3: The Seven Kingdoms and the Cross. By the 7th century, the Anglo-Saxon settlement this last chapter watched arrive had organized itself into a handful of larger, more durable kingdoms, and later historians, tidying a messier reality into a memorable label, would call the arrangement the Heptarchy, 7 kingdoms. Though the true count and their relative power shifted constantly across the centuries this series must compress. Northumbria in the harder north, Mercia dominating the Midlands for long stretches, East Anglia, Kent, Essex, Sussex, and Wessex, the last of which this series' own later chapters will watch grow, slowly and against real competition, into something considerably larger than a kingdom. This series will not trace every shift of overlordship among them. What matters for this chapter's purpose is that these kingdoms, whatever else divided them, were about to receive from two directions almost at once a faith that would give them their first genuinely shared institution since the Roman province this series' last chapter watched dissolve. Of the Anglo-Saxon king's own older beliefs, this series will say only what it can say honestly and briefly, because the fuller telling of this same Germanic pagan tradition belongs to this project's Vikings edition, whose Norse cousins these gods share close kinship with. In the belief of the pre-Christian Anglo-Saxons, a family of gods presided over war, wisdom, and the sky. Woden foremost among them, whose name survives quietly in the middle of the modern English week, approached through sacrifice and the same kind of localized, place-bound reverence this whole project has met in every pre-Christian culture it has told. This series names that belief plainly, holds it at the same respectful distance it holds every belief in every land it has walked, and moves, as the historical record itself moves quite rapidly in this period, toward the faith that would replace it. Christianity reached the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms from two directions in these same decades, and this series will give both their honest weight. From the northwest, Irish missionaries, heirs to a Christian tradition that had taken root in Ireland while Britain's own Roman-era Christianity was fading with the rest of Roman administration, carried their faith into Northumbria and beyond, building monasteries whose distinctive practices, a different method of calculating the date of Easter chief among them, would eventually need reconciling with Rome's own usage. And from the southeast, in the year 597, more than 14 centuries ago, a Roman monk named Augustine, sent by Pope Gregory the Great specifically to convert the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, landed in Kent and began a mission that would, within a single generation, see the King of Kent himself baptized and a church established at Canterbury that remains, to the present day, the seat of the senior bishop of the Church of England, a present-tense fact this series banks now for its own final chapters. The Roman and Irish traditions' differences were formally reconciled at a church council in the later 7th century, Rome's usage prevailing, and by the century's end, every one of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had, at least among its ruling class, accepted the new faith. This series must frame what that acceptance meant in the belief of the age, with the same care it has given every conversion story it has told. In Christian belief as this era understood it, the God of the new faith offered not merely a different set of rituals, but a different account of the world's whole order. One creator, one final judgment, and crucially for kings whose own legitimacy this whole series will spend its length interrogating, one source of authority a ruler could claim to derive his own power from. The doctrine of a king's rule as something owed to God rather than merely won by the sword begins, in this island's story, exactly here, in these conversion-era decades, and this series will track it, per its own Decision 6, all the way to the final chapter's depositions and battlefield coronations. The faith brought something else with it that deserves its own honest weight here. because it will matter more than almost anything else this chapter can offer. Books and the schools to make more of them. Monasteries founded in these same decades became, across the following century, centers of learning whose output this series will now let stand for itself. At the monastery of Jarrow in Northumbria, a monk named Bede, writing in the early 8th century, composed a history of the English Church and people that remains, to this day, one of the most important narrative sources for this whole period. This series has been drawing on his account, at one remove, for much of this chapter already, and Bede's own scholarly method, citing sources, weighing conflicting accounts, dating events by a calendar system whose Anno Domini convention he did more than any single figure to popularize into common use, marks him as one of the most careful historians of the whole early medieval world. A claim this series offers hedged exactly as it would for any comparable figure in any other land it has told. Alongside history, poetry, and this series must seat, before this chapter closes, the single greatest work of literature the Anglo-Saxon period left behind. Beowulf, an epic poem of some 3,000 lines, survives in a single manuscript, copied around the turn of the millennium but composed, most scholars believe, considerably earlier, telling of a Scandinavian hero's battles against a monster, the monster's vengeful mother, and, in old age, a dragon that costs him his life. A poem this series notes, with the cross-series affection it has earned, is set not in England at all, but among the Danes and Geats of Scandinavia. A reminder that the Anglo-Saxon and Norse worlds this whole project has now told two separate stories about were never, in their own imagination, entirely separate at all. The poem survives today, is still taught, still translated, still read aloud. A present tense fact this series will let stand without further comment until its own closing chapters. We may picture a scriptorium at one of these same monasteries on an ordinary working morning, built from the manuscripts and monastic customs this era left behind. A handful of monks sit at slanted writing desks in a room kept deliberately quiet, each copying, letter by careful letter, a portion of a gospel text onto prepared vellum, the animal skin scraped, stretched, and smoothed by weeks of separate labor before a single word could be set upon it. While in a separate, brighter corner, an illuminator works gold leaf and ground pigment into the elaborate interlacing patterns this era's finest manuscripts are still admired for today. Patterns that owe as much, art historians note, to the same Germanic decorative traditions the pre-Christian gods of this chapter's opening paragraphs were once honored with as they do to any Roman or Mediterranean Christian model. The work is slow. A single complete gospel book might take a skilled team the better part of a year, and it is, in the belief of the monks performing it, itself a form of prayer. The careful, patient, repetitive labor understood as an offering as much as the finished book itself. Outside, the kingdom's affairs go on without them, kings warring and marrying and dying in the pattern this whole period repeats without much variation. Inside the scriptorium, something considerably more durable than any one king's reign is quietly, patiently, letter by letter, being made to last. By the 9th century, this patchwork of Christian kingdoms had a shared faith, a shared and increasingly sophisticated written culture, and, in Wessex above every other kingdom, a rising ambition this series' next chapters will watch tested to its absolute limit, because a new arrival was about to reach these shores from across the North Sea. One this series' companion Vikings edition has already told in full from the opposite side of the story, and one this edition must now tell again, compressed, from the side of the kingdom that had to survive it. Rest a moment, if this chapter's quiet has earned it. The cross has reached every Anglo-Saxon kingdom on this island. The books are being made, and out on the grey North Sea, longships are already crossing. Chapter 4: The Northmen Come. This series must open its fourth chapter with an unusual admission and an honest reason for it. The story this chapter tells, Viking raids on English monasteries, the great heathen army's conquest of most of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, King Alfred of Wessex's desperate survival and eventual triumph, the Danelaw carved across the eastern half of the island, has already been told in full in this project's own Vikings edition, from the perspective of the longships themselves. This series will not retell that story at the same length. It will instead compress it deliberately, assuming a listener may already know its shape, and will spend its own limited attention on what that companion telling had less room for. What this experience actually did to the English kingdoms themselves from the inside, as the people living through it. The raids began, by most accounts, at the very end of the 8th century, when Norse ships struck the undefended monastery of Lindisfarne on the Northumbrian coast. A shock this series' companion edition gave its own full, honest paragraph, and which this series will not repeat, noting only that the raid's target, a community of monks with no defenses beyond their own faith, set the pattern of vulnerability that would define the following century's worst decades. Raiding gave way, within a few generations, to conquest. A large, coordinated Scandinavian force the sources call the Great Heathen Army landed in the 860s and, across roughly a decade, brought down the kingdoms of Northumbria and East Anglia entirely, reduced Mercia to a rump state under Viking-approved rulers, and, by 878, had driven the last independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom, Wessex, to the very edge of extinction. Its king, Alfred, reduced for a season to hiding in the marshes of Somerset with a small band of followers. The low point of a story this project's Vikings edition has already told from the winning side. What that companion telling could give only in passing, this series will give its full attention. What survived? Alfred's recovery, a victory at the Battle of Edington in 878 that forced the Viking leader Guthrum to accept baptism and a negotiated peace, did more than save Wessex. It preserved, in the one Anglo-Saxon kingdom that held, the entire cultural inheritance this series' last chapter spent its whole length describing: the scriptoria, the Latin learning, Bede's own historical tradition, and the very idea of a Christian English kingship this series has been tracking since the conversion era. Alfred himself, in the years of peace that followed, did something this series must credit fully, because it is exactly the kind of achievement this whole project loves best. Rather than simply defending what remained, he rebuilt it, founding schools, personally translating Latin works. He judged essential into the English tongue, so that, in his own stated reasoning, learning would not depend on Latin alone, and so be lost again the next time a kingdom's fortunes turned, and fortifying a network of defended towns, called burhs, that gave Wessex a resilience no single Anglo-Saxon kingdom had possessed before this crisis forced it into being. This series grants Alfred the epithet history itself gave him, the only English king ever to be called the Great by lasting popular tradition, and hedges it exactly as Decision 7's discipline requires, a title earned in the judgment of the tradition that followed him. Not an unhedged claim this series asserts as settled fact. His successors, across the following 2 generations, converted survival into reconquest, and this series will let one figure among them stand for the whole achievement, per its own Decision 5. Ethelfled, Alfred's daughter, ruled the Mercian border as Lady of the Mercians after her husband's death, and led by the plain evidence of the chronicles rather than any later embellishment, real campaigns against the Viking-held territories on her own frontier, fortifying towns and extending Mercian and Wessex authority north and east, with a competence her own male contemporaries recorded without evident surprise. A figure this series' companion Vikings edition may already have introduced from the opposite side of her own campaigns, and whom this series seats here, briefly, as fully deserving of the credit this island's own chroniclers gave her. By the time her nephew, Alfred's grandson, completed the reconquest in the 920s, the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms this series' 3rd chapter, described as a patchwork, had been welded, for the first time in this island's history, into something a chronicler could plausibly call a single kingdom of the English. Not without further crisis still to come, but real and lasting. That reconquest did not end the Scandinavian presence on this island. It simply changed its terms. The eastern half of the country, settled by Norse and Danish farmers across the generations of the great heathen army's conquest, remained substantially Scandinavian in law, custom, and even place names. The Danelaw, a term this series notes rather than dwells on, since its fuller texture belongs to the companion edition. Well after its political reconquest by Wessex's line, and the blending of Norse and English populations across these same eastern counties left a permanent mark on the English language itself, a debt this series' final chapters will pay in full alongside the rest of this island's inheritance. This series must compress the century that follows almost entirely, because it repeats, in broad shape, the pattern this chapter has already described. Further Scandinavian raids, and eventually, a second full-scale Viking conquest of England, under the Danish king Cnut, a figure whose reign this series' next chapter will take up directly, since it marks not another cycle of the same crisis, but something genuinely new. A Scandinavian king ruling England, not as a raider's prize, but as one part of a deliberately governed North Sea realm, administered, in significant part, through the very English institutions Alfred's line had spent a century building. Rest a moment, if this chapter's compression has left you wanting more. The fuller telling, this series says again plainly, waits in its companion edition. What this chapter has tried to give instead is the view from inside the Boer walls. A kingdom that came within one bad season of extinction, and chose, instead of merely surviving, to rebuild itself into something that could survive again. The next chapter watches what a conqueror does with a kingdom built that well. Chapter 5, Cnut's Crown and the Confessor. This series compresses one further Viking-era crisis before it can move to this chapter's true subject, and does so quickly, exactly as the last chapter promised. Renewed Scandinavian pressure across the late 10th and early 11th centuries, met by an English king this history remembers unkindly, and by most assessments, fairly, Ethelred, whose epithet, the Unready, is itself a play on his own name, meaning something closer to ill-counseled than truly unprepared. Though the tradition's judgment on his reign's competence is not, on the evidence, especially unfair, ended in a second full Scandinavian conquest. In 1016, more than 1,000 years ago, this series' first true millennium-crossing hinge, the Danish king Cnut secured the English throne, uniting it, for the length of his own reign, with Denmark and, later, Norway, into a genuine North Sea empire. What this series must give its own attention, where the companion Vikings edition necessarily gave Cnut's reign a broader, multi-kingdom canvas, is what kind of English king he actually became. Cnut, born a conqueror, ruled England by the substantial evidence of surviving law codes and charters, largely through existing English institutions rather than displacing them. English earls retained authority alongside Danish followers rewarded for the conquest. English law was reissued, and in places reformed rather than swept aside. And the king himself, in the belief-conscious terms this whole series has learned to use carefully, appears to have cultivated a genuine reputation for pious, orderly Christian kingship. The famous story, whatever its precise origins, of Cnut commanding the tide to halt and being deliberately, publicly proven wrong by the sea's indifference, is remembered by the chronicle tradition not as an act of arrogance, but as a staged demonstration of humility before God, a king showing his court the limits of even a conqueror's power. This series flags the story exactly as its own rules require. A moralizing anecdote, likely embellished or invented outright in the telling, whose real value lies in what it reveals about how this king wished to be remembered, not in any claim that the sea was ever actually commanded. Cnut's North Sea empire did not outlast him by more than a few years. His son's short and contested reigns collapsed the union of crowns almost as quickly as he had built it, and by 1042, the English throne returned to the old Wessex line in the person of Edward, a son of the unfortunate Ethelred, who had spent much of his youth in exile at the Norman court across the Channel. A detail this series must plant now, quietly, because it will matter enormously within a single generation. Edward's own piety earned him, in time, the epithet history still uses for him. The Confessor, a title reserved in Christian tradition for someone who lived an exemplary, saintly life, without the specific distinction of martyrdom, and Edward's own great monument to that piety, the abbey he founded and rebuilt at Westminster, remains, to this day, the site of English coronations. A present-tense fact this series banks for its closing chapters, and a building this series' own final image will have real cause to return to. What Edward's reign could not settle, and what this chapter must now build into the tension the next chapter resolves, was the one question this whole series will return to more than any other. Who comes after him? Edward's marriage produced no children, and as his reign lengthened without an heir, the English throne became the object of at least 3 serious, overlapping claims, each resting on a different theory of what makes a king legitimate. Precisely the question Decision 6 asks this series to track from its very first chapter. Harold Godwinson, head of one of the most powerful noble families in England, and, by the account of the English chronicle tradition, named by the dying Edward himself as his chosen successor, held the strongest claim by custom and by the dying king's own reported wish. Harold Hardrada of Norway, whose own story this series' companion Vikings edition has already told at length, claimed the throne through a decades-old agreement between earlier Scandinavian and English kings that this series will not untangle in full, since the companion edition has already done so. And William, Duke of Normandy, a distant cousin of Edward's through the Norman connections, this chapter planted a moment ago, and a man whose own account insisted, contested by the English sources on every point, that Edward had promised him the throne years before, and that Harold Godwinson himself had sworn, on sacred relics, to support that promise during a visit to Normandy, the circumstances of which the two traditions describe entirely differently. We may picture Edward's court at Westminster in the final months of his reign, built from the chronicle accounts and the abbey's own construction records this era left behind. The new abbey church, years in the building, rises unfinished around a king now too frail to attend its dedication in person. The court's great families circle a succession question no one dares raise directly while the king still breathes. Alliances and marriages of the preceding decade, all suddenly legible, in retrospect, as positioning for exactly this moment. And messengers who have crossed the channel more than once in recent years carry, in both directions, the kind of careful, deniable diplomatic language that later, when the crisis breaks, every party will remember rather differently than every other party does. Edward dies in early January of 1066, is buried in his own unfinished abbey, and within a single day, by the English Chronicle's own account, Harold Godwinson is crowned in the same building. Fast enough, this series notes without further comment that the speed itself would become one more point on which the rival claims would never agree. 3 claimants, 1 crown, and, for the first time in this whole series, though very much not the last, the sacred doctrine of anointed kingship about to collide directly with the plain fact that more than one man believed, with equal sincerity, that God's favor rested on his own claim rather than his rivals. This series closes this chapter on the edge of the crisis it has spent 5 chapters building toward, and opens the next one on the year that will decide it. A year that will see an English king fight, within a matter of weeks, 2 entirely different invasions from 2 entirely different directions, and lose in the end to neither the one this series' companion has already told in full, but to the other. Hastings is next. Chapter 6. Hastings. The year 1066 asked more of Harold Godwinson than it has asked of almost any other figure this whole series will meet, and this chapter will give him the honest, compressed accounting his brief reign deserves before turning to the single day that ended it. Crowned in January, Harold spent the following months watching 2 separate invasion threats mature at once, from 2 entirely different directions, and this series must state plainly what that meant militarily. An Anglo-Saxon king of this period commanded no standing professional army in any modern sense, but rather a corps of household warriors, the housecarls, supplemented by the fyrd, a levy of free landholders obligated to military service for a limited period each year. Men who needed, eventually, to return to their own harvests, whether or not the crisis that summoned them was actually finished. Harold spent the summer with his forces mustered in the south, watching the channel for William's promised Norman invasion, until the fyrd's supply and legal obligations forced him, in early September, to stand the muster down. At almost exactly the moment, this series notes with the irony the record itself preserves, that the second threat finally broke from the opposite direction entirely. Harold Hardrada of Norway landed in the north of England in September 1066 with a large invasion fleet, in support of a claim this series' companion Vikings edition has already told in full, and Harold Godwinson, informed of the landing, marched his household troops and whatever forces he could gather north at a pace the chronicles themselves marveled at, covering something close to 200 miles in under a week, and met the Norwegian invasion at Stamford Bridge on the 25th of September. A battle this series will not re-narrate in detail, since its companion edition told it fully and well, noting only its outcome and its cost. A decisive English victory, Harold Hardrada killed on the field, and an Anglo-Saxon army that had just marched the length of the country and fought a hard battle now needing, within days, to turn around and march the length of it again, because word reached Harold, almost before the northern battle's dead were buried, that William of Normandy had landed in the south, while the king's attention and his army's strength were both, of necessity, elsewhere. William's crossing itself deserves this series' attention, because it is the moment the channel motif this whole series has carried, since its opening chapter, delivers its most consequential single payoff. The Duke of Normandy had spent the summer assembling an invasion fleet and an army drawn from Normandy and considerably beyond it. Mercenaries and allied nobles from across northern France, drawn by the promise of English land, a detail this series will return to once the conquest's aftermath makes its full weight clear, and had waited, through weeks of unfavorable wind, for the channel to open in his favor exactly as this series' first chapter promised it eventually would. It opened in the closing days of September, almost the same days Harold's forces were engaged at Stamford Bridge 200 miles to the north, and William's fleet crossed unopposed, landing on the Sussex coast and beginning, immediately, to fortify a beachhead and to raid the surrounding countryside, a calculated provocation, most historians judge, intended to draw Harold into battle quickly, on ground and at a time of William's choosing, before the English king could gather the fuller strength a longer delay might have let him assemble. Harold obliged, marching his exhausted northern army south at the same extraordinary pace, gathering what fresh forces he could along the way, and meeting William's invasion force on the 14th of October, 1066, the hinge this whole series has been building toward since its very first chapter. At a ridge near Hastings, the two traditions would remember, ever after, by two different names. Senlac to the English chronicle tradition, Hastings to the Norman one that ultimately prevailed in the world's memory. A small but telling detail this series flags, because it is exactly the kind of naming victory this whole format has learned to notice. This series will give the battle itself in outcome, as always, and at the remove Rule F requires. The English fought on foot in the old tradition, forming a shield wall along the ridge's high ground. The same defensive formation this series' companion editions have described in other lands under other names. Men standing shoulder to shoulder behind overlapping shields, a wall of will as much as of wood and iron. William's forces, by contrast, fielded the mounted knights and archers that had become, on the continent, the more modern style of warfare, and the battle, fought across a single long day, turned, by most accounts, on a combination of Norman cavalry charges the shield wall initially held against, archery that gradually thinned the English ranks, and, at a decisive moment, a portion of the Norman force feigning retreat. Genuinely or by design, the sources themselves disagree. Drawing part of the English line down off the ridge in pursuit, and breaking the formation's integrity at the worst possible moment. Harold Godwinson himself died in the battle's final hours. The famous tradition of an arrow to the eye, first appearing in sources compiled after the fact and impossible to confirm with certainty. A detail this series flags exactly as it flags every comparably embellished battlefield death across its whole length. What the record agrees on, regardless of the precise manner, is that the king died fighting on the ridge, with his household troops dying around him rather than fleeing the field. This series will not linger past its own honest paragraph's natural close. An anointed English king, crowned less than a year earlier in Edward's own new abbey, chosen by the strongest available claim of custom and the dying king's own wish, lay dead on a Sussex hillside, and the channel that had carried Rome, the Anglo-Saxons, and two separate Viking conquests to this island across the centuries, this series has now walked in full, had just carried across it the conquest that would prove, of all of them, the most permanently transformative. We may picture the shield wall's final hour, built at the reconstruction honest remove this series always keeps for battle scenes. Along the ridge, the housecarls stand closest to the king's own banner, men who have served Harold's house for years, and who understand, as the light fails and the Norman cavalry presses a final, sustained assault, that the battle, and very possibly the kingdom, are being decided in the ground immediately around their own feet. Below them, on the slope, the day's dead already lie thick enough that the later charges must ride and climb over their own fallen as much as the English lines, and the noise the chronicles describe. No birdsong, no wind, only iron and men and horses, is the same noise this series has described on battlefields in 3 other countries now. Because that noise, this series has learned across every land it has told, does not change from story to story, however much the outcome does. Part 1 closes here, on a dead king, a landed conqueror, and a kingdom about to discover exactly what 4 centuries of comparatively gentle, internally negotiated Anglo-Saxon kingship had not prepared it for. William would spend the next several years making that discovery unmistakable, in ways this series' next part must give its own full and honest weight. Rest a moment, if you like, at the end of this long first part of the journey. The legions came and went. The faith took root. The Northmen came twice and were twice absorbed. And now, a third time, from the one direction this whole series' channel motif always warned might prove the most consequential of all. Conquest has come again. This time it will not be absorbed. It will rule. Part 2. Part 2, Chapter 1, The Conqueror's Peace. Welcome back. There is still no rush, and still no test. The channel has kept, exactly as promised. When we rested, an anointed English king lay dead on a Sussex hillside, and a Norman duke stood, for the first time, master of a kingdom his own household had spent a single autumn day winning by the sword, rather than by any claim the English chronicle tradition ever fully accepted. Settle in again. Part 2 watches what William did with that victory, and what it cost the people who had not chosen it. William was crowned in Edward's own new abbey at Westminster on Christmas Day, 1066. In a ceremony this series must note carried its own small, telling disruption. The acclamation shouted by the assembled crowd, in both English and Norman French, was mistaken by the Norman guards outside for the sound of a riot, and troops set fire to nearby buildings in the resulting confusion. A coronation beginning, quite literally, with smoke. A detail this series offers without further embellishment, because the historical record itself needs none. The new king's hold on his kingdom, in these first years, was considerably less secure than that single ceremony suggested. English resistance flared repeatedly across the following 4 years, in the west, in the southwest, and above all in the north, where rebellion, encouraged at various points by Danish intervention and by surviving members of the Old English nobility, proved persistent enough to draw William's own personal attention and eventually his own particular fury. This series must now deliver, in full, the honest paragraph its own build promised by name. In the winter of 1069 into 1070, following yet another rising in the north, William undertook a campaign historians call the Harrying of the North, and this series will report what the era's own chroniclers, writing decades later but drawing on living memory and earlier record, describe without softening: a deliberate, systematic devastation of Yorkshire and the surrounding counties, crops and stored grain burned, livestock killed or driven off, villages destroyed, and the region's productive capacity broken so thoroughly that the Domesday Survey this chapter will shortly describe, compiled some 16 years later, still records vast stretches of the north as waste, uncultivated, unproductive, in many cases apparently still substantially unrecovered from a single terrible winter a generation and a half earlier. The chronicler Orderic Vitalis, writing within living memory of the events, describes famine so severe that some among the survivors were reduced, by his account, to eating the flesh of the dead. A claim this series flags exactly as it flags every comparably extreme atrocity report across its whole length, as a contemporary or near-contemporary source's own testimony rather than an independently verifiable statistic, and reports, because even accounting for chronicle exaggeration, the archaeological and documentary record agrees the North suffered a genuine demographic and economic catastrophe from which whole districts took a generation or more to recover. This series states the plain conclusion without further softening. William secured his conquest in its most contested region through a deliberate policy of mass starvation, and this series will not let his considerable other achievements as a ruler and administrator, several of which this same chapter must now describe, launder that fact into a footnote. What followed the harrying across the remainder of William's reign was a systematic reordering of landholding across the entire kingdom, that this series must give its own honest weight, because it changed, permanently, who owned England. The Anglo-Saxon aristocracy this series' first part described was, within a generation of the conquest, almost entirely dispossessed. English lords who had held land for generations replaced, estate by estate, with William's own Norman followers, rewarded for their service in the conquest with holdings whose scale, in aggregate, represented one of the most complete transfers of landed wealth this island has ever experienced in so short a span. And onto that redistributed land rose the structure this series has been waiting 6 chapters to plant in full: the castle. This series' third motif could not be planted before this point in the story, for the simple reason that nothing quite like it existed in Anglo-Saxon England before the conquest brought it. The Normans built, in the years immediately following Hastings, castles by the hundreds across the conquered kingdom. Most, in this earliest wave, of the simple motte and bailey design this series will describe once, plainly. A mound of raised earth, the motte, topped with a wooden tower, standing beside an enclosed yard. The bailey, the whole structure raisable by a competent labor force in a matter of weeks rather than years. These were not, in their first generation, primarily defenses against foreign invasion. They were garrisons planted directly among a conquered population, visible from a hostile village's own fields, a permanent physical statement of who now held the land and who could, if the castle's garrison judged it necessary, enforce that holding by force at a moment's notice. Only later, across the following century, would many of these earthwork and timber structures be rebuilt in the stone this series' listeners more readily picture when they hear the word castle. But the function, from the very first raised motte, was already exactly what it would remain for the rest of this series' length. Power, made physical, standing over the conquered land it controlled. The Conqueror's other great achievement, and the one this series can credit without any honest paragraph's shadow attached, was administrative rather than military. In 1085, William commissioned what remains, to this day, an extraordinary document. A survey of nearly the entire kingdom, manor by manor, recording landholders, tenants, plow teams, livestock, and taxable value with a thoroughness that had few, if any, precedents anywhere in contemporary Europe, completed within a single year and compiled into 2 volumes that survive, largely intact, in the National Archives today. A present tense fact this series banks now. The survey's own popular name, Domesday Book, arose within a generation of its completion, drawn from the comparison English subjects themselves made to the final Christian judgment, because the record's verdict on a landholder's holdings was, in the same belief-conscious spirit, this series has tracked since its earliest chapters, understood as final and unappealable in exactly the way Doomsday Judgment was believed to be. We may picture a Domesday commissioner's visit to a single manor in the survey's own busy year, built from the document's own entries and the administrative practice historians have reconstructed around them. A royal official arrives with a small retinue and a standard list of questions, to be answered, the king's own instructions specify, by a sworn jury of local men, the reeve, the priest, and a number of villagers drawn from both the English and the new Norman landholding class, where both are present, under oath, with the explicit threat of legal penalty for any answer later found false. How many plough teams does the manor support, now and in the days of King Edward before the Conquest? So the assessors can measure exactly what the upheaval of the last 2 decades has cost or gained. How many villagers? How many smallholders? How many of the unfree cottagers this series' next several chapters will keep in careful, continuous view? What woodland, what meadow, what mills on the local stream, each rendering its own assessed value to the crown? The whole exercise is conducted, this series notes, in a single sworn, cross-checked sitting, the answers written first in draft and later copied, county by county, into the great volumes a king who would not live to see the project's full completion had ordered assembled. A conquered kingdom's every productive acre, counted, valued, and fixed in a single administrative act, whose thoroughness this series ventures with appropriate hedging would not be matched by any comparable European survey for centuries afterward. That is the Conqueror's piece in full. A North deliberately starved into submission, a native aristocracy replaced almost to the last landholder, castles planted over the conquered landscape to enforce the new order permanently, and, binding it all together, a written record so thorough its own subjects likened it to the Last Judgment. William died in 1087, his kingdom secured but never on the evidence of his own reign's methods, forgiven by the people who had lived through its making. What his sons and grandsons did with the crown he left behind, and what happened when, within a single generation, the crown's own succession broke as unexpectedly as it had broken at Hastings itself, is the next chapter's whole subject. And it begins. Fittingly for a story, this series has tied to the channel since its first page, with a ship that never reached the English shore at all. Chapter 2. The White Ship and the Anarchy. William the Conqueror's youngest son, Henry, secured the English throne in 1100 after the death of his older brother William Rufus in a hunting accident. This series will not dwell on beyond noting its own genuine ambiguity. An arrow shot by a companion, the circumstances never fully explained, and Henry's own suspiciously immediate seizure of the royal treasury, noted then as now, by observers who found the timing convenient in ways they were understandably careful not to say too loudly. Henry ruled for 35 years, longer than either his father or his brother, and secured, through decades of careful diplomacy and one crucial marriage, a peace with Normandy and a single legitimate son, William Adelin, whose survival to inherit both the English throne and the Norman duchy would have settled, cleanly, a succession. This series' opening chapters have already shown the listener how rarely settles cleanly at all. It did not settle cleanly, and this series must tell the reason plainly, because the wreck itself is one of the most consequential single accidents in this whole series' length. In November 1120, 900 years and more before this recording, the King's Court, having concluded business in Normandy, prepared to cross the Channel home, and William Adelin, the King's own heir, was offered passage on a newly refitted vessel, the White Ship, whose captain, by the near unanimous testimony of the chroniclers, allowed the young prince's party to delay their departure with an evening of drinking before finally putting to sea, well after the main royal fleet had already sailed, and by most accounts, considerably the worse for the delay themselves. The ship struck a submerged rock within sight of the harbor it had just left, and sank within minutes in the cold November water. Of the roughly 300 people aboard, tradition holds that a single survivor, a butcher from Rouen who had boarded to collect a debt, lived to tell what happened, clinging to wreckage through the night before being rescued the following morning. While William Adelin himself, having initially reached a small boat, drowned attempting to turn back for his half-sister when her cries for help reached him across the water, the small boat swamped by others desperate to be pulled aboard. This series will hold the story exactly at the distance its own sourcing earns. The account comes down through chroniclers writing after the fact, the drowning prince's own reported heroism impossible to verify independently, and this series flags it accordingly, exactly as it has flagged every comparably dramatic and comparably unverifiable death across its whole length. What is not in doubt is the consequence. Henry's only legitimate son and heir was dead, and the king, despite a second marriage contracted specifically to produce a replacement heir, would father no further children who survived him. The chronicler Orderic Vitalis, whose account this series has already leaned on once this part, and will lean on again, records that Henry never smiled again after learning of his son's death. A claim this series flags as the kind of moralizing embellishment this format has learned to recognize on sight, offered because it captures, whether or not literally true, the genuine political catastrophe the wreck represented for a king who had spent decades securing a succession the sea had just undone in a single night. Henry's remaining solution was, by the standards of this series' own Decision 6, genuinely radical. He compelled his barons to swear an oath of loyalty to his daughter, Matilda, widow of the Holy Roman Emperor, and, by Henry's own explicit designation, his chosen heir to the English throne, a woman claiming the crown in her own right, a possibility this series' companion editions have shown was not unknown elsewhere in medieval Europe, but which English custom, on the evidence of what follows, was not remotely prepared to accept in practice, whatever the barons' sworn oaths had promised in principle. Henry died in 1135, and within weeks, the crisis this series' whole first part has been quietly rehearsing broke open in full. Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew and, crucially, a man rather than a woman, crossed to England, secured the support of key barons and of the church, and had himself crowned before Matilda could mount an effective response. The sworn oath, this series notes without further comment, proving considerably less binding in the moment than it had seemed at the swearing. Matilda did not accept the usurpation, and the two claimants' rival cases, each resting on a genuinely different theory of what makes a crown legitimate, sworn oath and paternal designation on Matilda's side, the practical fact of coronation, and the plain preference of the barons and the church for a male ruler on Stephen's, plunged England into a civil war lasting close to 2 decades that this era's own chroniclers described, in among the most quoted lines this whole period left behind, in a phrase this series will render carefully rather than reproduce verbatim from any one translation, that for 19 long years God and his angels seemed to sleep, while the land descended into a lawlessness in which castle-holding barons, freed of any effective royal check, preyed on the countryside largely for their own account. This period is remembered ever after simply as the Anarchy. This series will not narrate the war's many indecisive campaigns and sieges in detail, per its own dissolving discipline, and will note only the shape of its resolution. Matilda's own cause never secured the crown outright, though she came close enough, at one dramatic low point for Stephen, to hold him briefly captive. But her son, Henry, inherited her claim, and by the early 1150s had built enough military and political momentum that Stephen, his own son having predeceased him, agreed to a negotiated settlement recognizing young Henry as his successor, rather than continue a war neither side could any longer sustain. Stephen died the following year, in 1154, and Henry, the second king of that name this series will meet, and by a wide margin the more consequential of the two, took the throne without further contest, inheriting not merely England, but through his own father's title and his own remarkable marriage. A set of continental holdings this series' next chapter must describe at the scale they actually reached. We may picture the closing months of the Anarchy at one of the many castles this civil war's own combatants had thrown up across the countryside, with little regard for royal license, built from the chronicle accounts of the period's own lawlessness. A local baron, holding a hastily fortified motte his family had raised without the crown's permission during the war's worst years, extracts tolls and levies from travelers and neighboring villages alike, answerable in practice to no authority beyond his own garrison's strength, while the surrounding countryside, the chronicler's own account records, lay in significant part uncultivated, its people fled or too impoverished by repeated exactions to plant what they could not be confident of harvesting. The castle, this series' own third motif, planted a chapter ago as an instrument of conquest, has become, in these unsupervised decades, something closer to a private kingdom's own wall. A lesson the young king who now inherits the throne will spend much of his own long reign making certain no baron in England is ever again permitted to relearn. That king's reign, and the vast, genuinely astonishing cross-channel realm he ruled, alongside one of the most remarkable women this whole series will meet, is the next chapter's whole subject. Rest a moment, if the wreck and the long war that followed it have earned it. The crown has broken once already in this island's post-conquest story, and been mended this time, not by right, but by exhaustion. It will not be the last time this series watches exhaustion do the work that law and blood, between them, could not. Chapter 3. The Angevin Storm. Henry II inherited, at his coronation in 1154, not merely the English crown this series' last chapter watched settle at last after nearly 2 decades of civil war, but a continental territorial holding of a scale. This series must state plainly before it can be properly appreciated. Through his father, Henry held the county of Anjou and the duchy of Normandy, and through his own marriage, contracted only 2 years before his coronation, to a woman whose own story this chapter must give its full and considerable due, he held the vast duchy of Aquitaine in the southwest of France as well. Add England itself, and the resulting realm. Historians call it, for convenience, the Angevin Empire, after the House of Anjou, stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, a domain considerably larger, by most measures of territory and revenue alike, than the Kingdom of France, whose own king was, in the strict feudal terms of the age, Henry's nominal overlord for every one of his French holdings. This series' channel motif, planted in its very first chapter as a hinge rather than a wall, delivers here its fullest possible payoff. For the whole of Henry's reign, and considerably beyond it, the Channel was not a frontier separating an English kingdom from a French one, but a highway running through the middle of a single, sprawling, cross-channel realm whose king spent as much of his reign on one side of the water as the other. The marriage that made this possible deserves this series' full attention, per its own Decision 5, because the woman at its center was, by any honest measure, this whole project has yet applied to a medieval figure, one of the most remarkable political actors of the entire European Middle Ages. Eleanor of Aquitaine inherited her own vast duchy in her own right as a young woman, married first the King of France, accompanied him on crusade in a level of active participation, the chronicles record, with evident fascination and occasional disapproval, saw that marriage annulled after some 15 years without a surviving son, and then, within weeks of the annulment's finalization, married Henry, 11 years her junior, already Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, and soon, through her own inherited lands added to his, master of the Angevin realm this chapter has just described. Eleanor bore Henry 8 children, several of whom this series' own later chapters must meet in their own right, and remained, across a marriage that curdled badly in its middle years into open political rivalry. Eleanor backing her own son's rebellion against their father in the 1170s, an act of defiance, Henry answered, by keeping her under varying degrees of confinement for the last 16 years of his own reign. One of the most consequential figures in the whole of this series' remaining length, outliving Henry by 15 years and living to see 2 of her own sons crowned King of England in succession. Henry's own achievement, distinct from the marriage that made his continental empire possible, deserves this series' own superlative treatment, planted here per Decision 7. Across his reign, Henry undertook a systematic reform of English royal justice, whose institutions and principles this series will trace directly into the modern day. Royal judges sent out on regular circuits to hear cases in the localities, rather than requiring every dispute to travel to a single royal court. A growing reliance on sworn juries of local men to establish facts in both criminal and property disputes, an institution this series' listener will recognize as the direct ancestor of the jury system still in use across much of the English-speaking world today, and a body of legal principle built case by case through royal judges' decisions and increasingly treated as binding precedent for future cases that would come to be called, simply, the common law. Common, in the sense that it applied, at least in principle, uniformly across the whole kingdom, rather than varying by the particular custom of each individual lord's court. This series states its second pre-approved superlative here, plainly. English common law, whose foundations Henry's reforms laid more thoroughly than any single predecessors, stands among the most influential legal systems in world history, forming the basis, in whole or in part, of the law across a large portion of the world today. A claim this series will echo, unhedged, in its own closing chapters, once the full span of that later influence can be properly shown. We may picture a royal court traveling between its English and continental holdings in a single representative year of Henry's reign. Built from the itinerary records and administrative correspondence, this restless, famously energetic king's government generated in genuinely enormous quantity. The king's household, chancery clerks with their portable writing desks and sealed document chests, a treasury staff tracking revenue owed and collected across a dozen distinct territories with a dozen distinct currencies and customs, judges dispatched ahead to hold court in towns the king himself may never personally visit that year, moves by cart, by horse, and, at the Channel's own crossing, by ship, in a constant circuit the chroniclers describe with a mixture of admiration and genuine exhaustion. Henry himself, by the eyewitness account of a churchman who served in his court, rarely sat still even at meals, conducting business standing, pacing, dictating to several clerks on different matters within the same hour. This is government not as a fixed institution in a fixed capital, this series notes, but as a moving apparatus following a tireless king across an empire too large and too scattered to govern any other way. And it is precisely this restless, itinerant style of kingship, this series ventures, that the common law's own traveling judges were built to extend into every corner of the realm the king's own body could not personally reach. Henry's reign, for all its administrative brilliance, ended badly, and this series will give the ending its own honest, brief weight before turning to the conflict, still ahead in this same part, that did more than any single episode to sour his later years. His sons, backed at various points by their own mother and by the King of France himself, rebelled against him repeatedly across the 1170s and 1180s, and Henry died in 1189. By the chronicler's own account, broken-hearted to learn in his final illness that his favorite and youngest son, John, had joined the rebellion against him alongside his elder brothers. The throne passed to the eldest surviving son, Richard, a king this series' next chapter must introduce through the legend that made him famous and the neglect of his own kingdom that made him on the ledger this series always keeps. A considerably more complicated figure than the legend allows. Rest a moment, if this chapter's sprawling empire has earned it. The crown of England, for the length of this chapter and considerably beyond it, has ruled more of France than any French king managed to hold himself. A genuine, verifiable superlative this series is glad to state without hedging. Though the empire that made it possible was already, even before Henry's death, showing the cracks his own sons had done so much to open. What Richard and John do with that inheritance, and what it costs the crown to lose most of it, is the next chapter's business. Chapter 4. Murder in the Cathedral. This series must step back several years within Henry II's own long reign to tell a conflict the last chapter's focus on empire and law had no room for, and which belongs, by any honest measure, among the most consequential single events of his entire 35 years on the throne. In 1162, Henry appointed his own chancellor and close friend, Thomas Becket, to the Archbishopric of Canterbury, the senior position in the English Church, vacant at the time, and a position Henry, by most historians' judgment, intended to use precisely as this series' own Decision 6 would predict. a trusted royal servant, elevated to the Church's highest English office, who might extend royal authority over ecclesiastical affairs, the crown had long found troublesome to control. Becket's own transformation upon taking the office is one of the more genuinely startling character shifts this whole series will record. A man who had served the king's interests energetically and, by some contemporary accounts, rather worldly for over a decade as chancellor became, within months of his consecration as archbishop, an unyielding defender of the Church's independence from royal authority, to Henry's evident fury and, this series ventures, his genuine personal betrayal. The conflict that followed centered, in its narrowest legal form, on a genuinely difficult question this series must frame carefully, rather than resolve on the listener's behalf. Whether clergy accused of serious crimes should be tried in the Church's own courts, which could not impose capital punishment, or in the king's courts, which could. Henry, seeking uniform royal justice across his realm exactly as the last chapter's common law reforms would predict, pressed for royal jurisdiction. Becket, invoking the Church's own claimed independence from secular authority, a position with real theological and legal grounding in the wider medieval Christian world, not merely personal obstinacy, resisted at every turn, fled into exile on the continent for 6 years rather than submit, and returned to England in 1170 only, after a strained, incomplete reconciliation with the king that neither man, on the evidence of what followed almost immediately, actually trusted to hold. This series must now deliver the honest paragraph its own build promised by name. In December 1170, following reports that reached him on the continent of Becket, excommunicating several bishops who had crowned Henry's own son without Canterbury's sanction, Henry, in a fit of anger the chroniclers record with some variation in his exact words, but general agreement on their fury, is said to have asked aloud who would rid him of this troublesome priest. A phrase this series flags, exactly as it flags every comparably famous quotation across its whole length, as the chronicle tradition's own rendering rather than a verified transcript. 4 knights of Henry's household, taking the outburst as authorization whether or not the king had intended it as a literal command, crossed to England and confronted Becket inside Canterbury Cathedral itself on the 29th of December, where he had refused the cathedral monks' urging to bar the doors against them, reportedly declaring that a church was not a fortress to be defended by force. This series will report what happened next, at the outcome and meaning distance Rule F requires for every death in this whole project. The knights struck Becket down at the base of a cathedral stair, killing an archbishop inside his own church on holy ground, in an act that shocked Christian Europe far beyond England's own borders, and that Henry himself, whatever his precise culpability in provoking it, spent the following years publicly and genuinely atoning for. Walking barefoot into Canterbury in 1174 to be scourged by the cathedral's monks in a formal act of penance, a humiliation few kings in this whole series' length will accept so completely. Becket was canonized as a saint within 3 years of his death, his shrine at Canterbury becoming, almost immediately, one of the most important pilgrimage destinations in medieval Christendom. A status this series will meet again, 2 centuries later, in the fictional pilgrims of a very different kind of literature. And the conflict's own resolution, in the narrow legal terms that had started it, was genuinely ambiguous. Henry retained, in practice, much of the royal authority he had sought, while the Church's own claimed independence from secular criminal jurisdiction survived, formally, for centuries afterward. This series states the tension plainly, per Decision 6, rather than declare either side the clean winner. Crown and altar, each claiming final authority in this island's own unfolding story of what makes power legitimate, had tested their rival claims against each other in the most direct way either institution knew, and neither had definitively prevailed. We may picture Canterbury Cathedral on an ordinary evening not long before the murder, built from the cathedral's own surviving architecture and the monastic customs of the age. Vespers has just concluded, the monks filing back toward their quarters through cloisters lit by failing December light. The cathedral itself settling into the particular hush of a great stone building at the close of a working liturgical day. Becket himself, by the accounts of monks who were present, had spent recent weeks aware that his return from exile carried real danger and had continued, regardless, the full round of his archiepiscopal duties without visible alteration. The same discipline, this series notes, that would keep him inside an unbarred church on the night his enemies finally arrived. The cathedral stands today, rebuilt and expanded across the centuries since, still the seat of the Church of England's senior bishop, still visited by pilgrims and tourists in numbers. This series will let stand as its own present tense payment when its final chapters come to collect them. Rest a moment, if this chapter's grave subject has earned it. Crown and Church have tested each other and drawn back, neither fully victorious. Henry's own empire, for all this bitter interlude, remains intact and formidable as this part resumes its forward march. What his sons do with that inheritance, one abroad on crusade and mostly absent from his own kingdom, the other at home and, in time, considerably worse remembered, is the next chapter's business. Chapter 5. Lionheart and Lackland. Richard I inherited the Angevin realm this part has spent 2 chapters describing at its fullest extent, and this series must state honestly and without the legend's usual reverence exactly how little of his 10-year reign he actually spent inside the kingdom whose crown he wore. By most historians' reckoning, no more than 6 months total. The overwhelming remainder spent on crusade in the eastern Mediterranean, in continental warfare defending his French territories, or, for over a year, in captivity. A king whose own epithet, Lionheart, this series grants exactly as it granted Alfred's the Great, per Decision 7's discipline. A title earned in the judgment of a later, admiring tradition. Not an unhedged claim, this series asserts as its own verdict on his actual governance. This series will keep the crusade material genuinely brief, per its own build's explicit instruction, because the fuller, honest telling of that vast and multi-sided conflict is not this series' subject and does not belong compressed into a single supporting chapter. What this series will say plainly is this. Richard led a major contingent of the Third Crusade, won real battlefield victories against the forces of Saladin, and failed in the end to retake Jerusalem itself, negotiating instead a truce guaranteeing Christian pilgrims access to the city rather than Christian rule over it. A campaign remembered in the European chivalric tradition that shaped Richard's own later reputation as a triumph of personal valor, and remembered in the honest ledger this series always keeps, as a war whose human cost on every side this format's own standing caution against sensationalizing violence forbids this series from narrating in any further detail than that plain outcome. Returning from crusade, Richard was captured and held for ransom by the Holy Roman Emperor's own ally, a diplomatic humiliation that cost the English crown a sum this series notes without further embellishment was genuinely enormous. Commonly estimated at multiple times the crown's annual revenue, raised through taxation that fell, as such levies always did in this series' own recurring ledger, disproportionately on a population that had no say whatsoever in the crusade that had occasioned it. Richard died in 1199 from a wound taken besetting a minor castle in France over a treasure dispute this series will let dissolve into the footnote it genuinely was, leaving no legitimate children and the throne to his younger brother John. The same John this chapter's opening paragraphs already flagged as the son whose rebellion had broken his own father, Henry's heart. John's reign, by contrast with his brother's absentee glamour, was spent overwhelmingly inside his own territories, and this series must state plainly why that made so little practical difference to how badly it went. Within 5 years of taking the throne, John had lost the great majority of the Angevin continental empire this part's 3rd chapter described at such length. Normandy, Anjou, and most of the remaining French holdings falling to the French king Philip Augustus through a combination of John's own diplomatic and military failures and the underlying structural weakness this series' own honest ledger must now acknowledge. An empire held together across Henry II's reign, largely by one exceptionally capable king's own restless personal energy, proved considerably less durable in the hands of a less capable and less trusted successor. The loss earned John the second unflattering epithet this chapter's title carries, Lackland, though this series notes, with the same hedged honesty it gives every such label, that the nickname's precise medieval origin is somewhat more complicated than the simple loser of lands reading later popular memory settled on, and dates in part from before the losses that made it seem so aptly prophetic in hindsight. We may picture a channel port in the years immediately following the Norman losses, built from the customs records and merchant correspondence this administrative shift left behind. A harbor official who has spent 2 decades processing the steady traffic of revenue, officials, and correspondence flowing between England and Normandy now watches that traffic thin to a fraction of its former volume. The great cross-channel estates, whose lords had held land on both sides of the water, a common and until now entirely unremarkable arrangement for the Anglo-Norman aristocracy this series has followed since the Conquest. Forced, in many cases, to choose one side or the other as the French crown confiscated the continental holdings of any lord who remained loyal to John. The channel motif, planted as a hinge in this series' 1st chapter, and shown swinging open at Hastings, and again across the whole of the Angevin century, is here shown swinging the other way, not carrying conquest and unity across the water, but closing, deliberately and permanently, the empire that water had briefly made possible. John's difficulties did not end with the continental losses, and this series closes this chapter on the crisis they set in motion at home. Because it is the crisis the next chapter's whole subject grows directly out of. Stripped of the continental revenues that had funded the Angevin realm at its height, John turned to increasingly aggressive taxation and increasingly arbitrary treatment of his own English barons to fund both his ongoing continental ambitions and his own domestic authority. Extraordinary financial exactions, interference in inheritance and wardship that struck at the baron's own most basic interests, and a pattern of high-handed justice that alienated, across the first decade and a half of his reign, precisely the class of men whose cooperation any medieval English king actually needed to govern effectively. By 1215, that alienation had hardened into open rebellion, and John, cornered in a way this series' whole opening chapters have shown crowns in this story periodically are, found himself facing a demand no English king had ever been forced to answer in quite so formal and lasting a document before. The Great Charter is next. Chapter 6. The Great Charter. The rebellion John's own reign had made all but inevitable came to a head in the spring of 1215, when a substantial coalition of England's barons, having formally renounced their homage to a king they judged had broken faith with them beyond repair, seized London and forced John to the negotiating table. Not out of any shared vision of government this series will pretend was more coherent or forward-looking than it actually was, but out of a specific, urgent list of grievances a cornered king now had no remaining leverage to refuse outright. The document that resulted, sealed at a meadow beside the Thames called Runnymede on the 15th of June, 1215, more than 8 centuries ago, was not, in its own moment, remotely the founding constitutional monument later centuries would make of it. And this series must state that honestly before it states anything else about the Charter's real importance. Magna Carta, as it came to be called once a shorter charter concerning royal forests was issued separately some years later, was, in its immediate content, a distinctly practical, often narrowly self-interested document. The great majority of its 60-odd clauses address specific baronial grievances over feudal dues, inheritance, wardship, and the administration of royal forests. Matters of intense concern to the propertied nobility who forced its sealing and of considerably less direct relevance to the peasantry, this series has tracked continuously since Part 1's own earliest manorial chapters, who receive, in the Charter's own text, essentially no attention at all. And yet, this series must now deliver, per Decision 7, the superlative its own build pre-approved, planted here in the same breath as the honest complication that gives it its real shape rather than a false, inflated one. Magna Carta is widely regarded as one of the foundational documents in the development of the principle that even a monarch is subject to the law, a claim resting not on the Charter's immediate 1215 content or effect, which this series has just described honestly as limited and largely self-interested, but on a small number of its clauses, chief among them the promise that no free man would be imprisoned, dispossessed, or destroyed except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land, and the explicit, radical structural provision establishing a council of 25 barons empowered to hold the king to the charter's own terms, by force if necessary. Those clauses, reinterpreted, reissued, and in places reinvented by later centuries, English lawyers of the 17th century above all, who read into the 1215 document a coherent tradition of constitutional limitation on royal power. It had not, in truth, originally possessed in anything like so developed a form, became, over 5 centuries of later legal and political argument, one of the central symbolic touchstones of English and eventually American constitutional thought. This series honors both halves of that history equally. The modest, self-interested document actually sealed at Runnymede, and the towering constitutional symbol later centuries built, largely after the fact, upon its surviving clauses. The Charter's own immediate practical history, this series must note before moving on, was considerably less triumphant than its later reputation suggests. John, having sealed the document under duress, appealed almost immediately to the Pope to annul it, succeeded within weeks, and the Barons' rebellion resumed in open civil war before John's own death, from illness in October 1216, removed him from the equation entirely. The charter was reissued, in revised and in places substantially altered form, by the Regency government ruling in the name of John's 9-year-old son, Henry III, and reissued again several times across the following decades. A pattern of repeated reissue and revision, this series notes, that is itself part of the honest story. Magna Carta's later fame rests less on any single triumphant moment of 1215 than on its own remarkable persistence, reasserted and renegotiated across generations until certain of its principles had become, by simple repetition and gradual legal accretion, genuinely embedded in English governance in a way no single sealing at a single meadow could have accomplished alone. That accretion deserves this series' attention in one further respect, because it connects directly to the texture this series' own build prompt flagged as worth real narrative weight, without promoting it to a full motif. The Council of Barons Magna Carta's own text empowered to check the king was a crude, self-interested instrument by later standards. But it belongs to a lineage this series has been tracking since its own opening chapter's brief mention of the Anglo-Saxon Witan. The king's council of nobles and churchmen consulted in varying degrees across the centuries on matters of law and taxation, a lineage that would run forward from this same crisis through Henry III's own troubled reign, in which a baronial reformer named Simon de Montfort would, in 1265, summon a council including not merely nobles and bishops, but elected representatives of the towns and shires as well. In an assembly later, historians would recognize as a genuine, if still crude, ancestor of the English Parliament. This series' own final chapters will trace forward into its modern, two-house form. This series will not dwell further on that lineage here. It notes only that the same crisis that produced Magna Carta's practical, self-interested clauses also produced, in the same gesture, the seed of an institution. This whole series' remaining length will watch grow, unevenly but unmistakably, into a genuine check on royal power considerably more durable than any single charter's sealed wax. We may picture the meadow at Runnymede itself on the day of sealing, built from the charter's own text and the chronicle accounts of the surrounding negotiations. tents and pavilions stand on both banks of the Thames. The baron's own armed retinues, visible enough to make the negotiations' real terms plain without a single further word needing to be spoken about who held the practical advantage. John himself, by every account a man furious at the position he had been forced into, affixes the royal seal. Not, this series notes for accuracy, a personal signature in the modern sense, since the Great Seal's wax impression was the era's own instrument of formal royal authority, to a document whose clauses his own clerks had spent the preceding days negotiating, clause by clause, against the baron's own legal advisers. And the assembled witnesses, barons and bishops alike, understand this series ventures that they have won a specific practical set of concessions from a cornered king, and considerably less certainly that they have set in motion anything the distant future would call constitutional government at all. The meadow at Runnymede remains, to this day, a site of pilgrimage for exactly the reason this series has just described, a modest patch of riverside ground, made permanently significant not by what it accomplished in a single afternoon, but by what later centuries, reading their own hopes back into its surviving clauses, chose to make of it. Rest a moment, if this chapter's careful weighing has earned it. A king has been forced, for the first time in this island story, to submit his own authority to a written check. However narrow, however self-interested, however quickly he himself tried to escape it. The next chapter turns to his grandson, a king who would extend this island's crown further than any predecessor this series has yet described, over Wales, over Scotland, and, in this series' darkest honest paragraph so far, over a Jewish community whose expulsion this series will not let his military triumphs soften into a footnote. Chapter 7. Hammer of the Scots. Edward I, who took the throne in 1272 after his father Henry III's own long and often troubled reign, a reign this series compresses almost entirely, per its own dissolving discipline, noting only that it saw Simon de Montfort's parliamentary experiment this series' last chapter already described, and a baronial civil war that experiment's own collapse briefly provoked, inherited a kingdom considerably more settled than John's had been, and used that settlement to pursue a program of conquest and consolidation. This series must narrate with a discipline its own decision for demands. The winning side's triumph, honestly told, and the losing side's own voice and grievance given equal and genuine weight. Not folded silently into a triumphant English narrative, this format has promised, from its very first chapter, not to tell. Wales, by Edward's reign, remained substantially under the rule of its own native princes, chief among them Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, who had built, across the preceding decades, a genuine and internationally recognized principality in the mountainous north and west of the country. A Wales, this series must state plainly, was not a backward or ungoverned land awaiting English order, but a distinct people with their own language, law, and political tradition, defending, in the wars Edward now launched against them, exactly the kind of sovereign independence this whole series has spent its length insisting every people has a legitimate claim to. Edward's campaigns, conducted across the 1270s and 1280s with a scale of resources and a systematic use of castle building, this series' own third motif, must now extend into new territory, culminated in Llywelyn's death in an obscure skirmish in 1282 and the effective end of independent Welsh princely rule. Edward's response, in the years following, was to ring the conquered principality with a chain of massive new stone castles, Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech among them, whose scale and sophistication mark, by most military historians' judgment, among the most ambitious fortification programs undertaken anywhere in medieval Europe, and whose function this series notes exactly as it noted the earliest Norman mots 2 centuries earlier, was the same. Power, made physical, over a conquered people who had not chosen this outcome and whose own princes' names deserve to be remembered. This series ventures as more than merely the losing side of an English triumph. Scotland's own wars against Edward, compressed here but not silenced, followed a related but distinct pattern later generations would remember on the Scottish side. With a fierceness this series will let stand honestly rather than smooth over. Edward, invited to arbitrate a disputed Scottish succession in the 1290s, used the opportunity to assert increasingly direct overlordship over the Scottish crown, provoking a resistance this series will name, briefly and by their own right, rather than merely as obstacles to an English king's ambition. William Wallace, a knight of relatively modest standing who led a genuinely popular Scottish resistance to real military effect, before his eventual capture and execution in 1305. An execution this series will report, per its own decision 4. At the outcome and meaning distance this format applies to every judicial killing in its whole length, without the elaborate procedural detail some popular retellings have since supplied, and Robert the Bruce, who would, in the years following Edward's own death in 1307, complete what Wallace's own resistance had begun and secure. For a further period, this series' own scope does not extend to cover genuine Scottish independence from the English crown. This series states plainly, per Decision 4, D's own instruction, what these wars actually were. Not a single confident kingdom's tidy expansion, but a series of contested, often brutal campaigns against peoples defending real and legitimate claims to their own self-rule, whose resistance deserves this series' honest respect rather than its silence. And now this series must deliver, in full and without softening, the darkest honest paragraph its own build promised by name. One this series has been laying the groundwork for since well before this chapter began, because the culmination it must now describe was never an isolated event. However, Edward's own military reputation has tended, in popular memory, to overshadow it. England's Jewish community, established since shortly after the conquest, and serving, for much of the intervening 2 centuries, a financial role the Church's own usury restrictions on Christians had left largely open to them, faced escalating persecution across this entire period. This series must now name honestly, rather than confine to a single closing paragraph. The York Massacre of 1190, in which the city's Jewish population, besieged in the castle by a mob during the same crusading fervor that sent Richard the Lionheart abroad, chose mass suicide over what they judged the certain alternative of massacre by the crowd outside. Recurring blood libel accusations, the entirely false and murderous claim, appearing repeatedly across this period's chronicles, that Jewish communities ritually murdered Christian children, which fueled violence and legal persecution in city after city across the 13th century, and increasingly punitive taxation, culminating under Edward's own father Henry III in exactions so severe that much of the community's former wealth had already been extracted by the crown well before this chapter's own king ever took the throne. Edward's own contribution to this documented pattern was its culmination, not its origin, and this series will not let that distinction soften what he actually did. In 1290, Edward issued an edict expelling the entire Jewish population of England, some several thousand people by most historians' estimates, permanently from the kingdom, one of the earliest and most consequential wholesale national expulsions of a Jewish community in medieval European history, their remaining property confiscated by the crown, their departure for those who survived the crossing, scattering them to communities in France and elsewhere on the continent. This series states the plain historical fact without further embellishment. No Jewish community would exist openly in England again for over 3.5 centuries, until a formal resettlement in the following era this series' own scope does not reach. This series will not let Edward's very real military and administrative achievements, described honestly in this same chapter, launder this act into a footnote. It is reported here deliberately, after the castles and the conquests rather than before them, exactly as its own build instructed, so that the listener weighs it as this series always insists such things be weighed. Fully and last, and without the comfort of a triumphant narrative arriving right afterward to hurry past it. We may picture a Jewish family's final departure from an English port in the autumn of 1290, built from the documentary record of the expulsion's own administration. The Crown, this series notes, kept careful account of the process, even as it dispossessed the people subjected to it. A household that has lived in England for generations, its trade and its synagogue, and its dead in the local burial ground, all rooted in a town its family has called home longer than most of its Christian neighbors' own families have held their land, packs what portable wealth the expulsion's terms permit them to carry. Having already surrendered, under the edict's own provisions, the greater part of what they owned. At the quay, royal officials check names against the expulsion's own administrative lists, and the family boards a crossing to a continent many of them have never seen, the England genuinely behind them now. This series notes with the same plain finality the historical record itself carries. For longer than this whole series' remaining length will need to cover before it reaches its own final chapter. Part 2 closes here, on a kingdom more thoroughly conquered, more thoroughly administered, and more thoroughly, permanently diminished by its own crown's darkest act than at any point since William's own harrying of the North 2 centuries earlier. Edward's reign gave this island's crown its most extensive reach yet. Wales ringed in stone, Scotland contested, and for now subdued, the common law and the Parliament this part has tracked, since Magna Carta both further entrenched. And it did so while committing an act this series will not let the ledger's other entries balance out. Rest a moment, if you like, at the end of this long, expansionist second part of the journey. What comes next tests this crown more severely than anything it has yet faced. A king deposed for the first time in this island's post-conquest story, a war that will run for more than a century, and a plague that will kill, by some counts, nearly half the people this whole series has spent 2 parts describing. Part 3. Part 3, Chapter 1, The Longbow's Century begins. Welcome back, one more time. There is still no rush. The channel has kept, and the crown this whole series has followed since a chalk-down farmstead first came into view is about to be tested more severely than at any point since a Norman duke first claimed it by conquest. When we rested, Edward I lay dead with Wales ringed in stone and Scotland unbroken beneath him, and a kingdom expanded further than at any point in this story stood ready, in the way kingdoms always eventually do, to discover exactly how much of that expansion had depended on one formidable man's own will. Settle in again. Part 3 opens with the discovery. Edward II inherited his father's wars and almost none of his father's gifts for waging them. This series will compress his reign to the honest verdict it earned even in its own time. A king more interested, by the consistent testimony of his own nobility, in the company of a small circle of intimate favorites than in the business of governing, whose military ventures against Scotland ended in humiliating defeat rather than his father's hard-won subjugation, and whose favoritism provoked, across 2 decades, an escalating baronial opposition that culminated in 1327 in something this island's post-conquest history had not yet seen. A reigning, anointed king formally deposed by an alliance of his own barons and his own queen, forced to abdicate in favor of his teenage son, and killed within the year in circumstances the chronicles report, with a relish this series will not repeat, beyond noting that the manner of his death became, almost immediately, the stuff of exactly the kind of grim legend this format always flags as legend rather than fact. This series must pause on the deposition itself, because it is this whole part's first full test of the sacred kingship doctrine planted since Part 1. An anointed king, in the Church's own belief, held his crown from God directly, and yet here was a parliament of his own subjects declaring, in formal session, that he had governed so badly he had forfeited it. A doctrine and a fact sitting in open, unresolved tension, exactly as this series promised, at its outset, never to resolve for the listener on its own authority. His son, crowned as Edward III at 14, and ruling in his own right within a few years of throwing off the regency that had engineered his father's fall, spent a reign of exceptional length restoring the crown's prestige with a single-mindedness his father had never managed, and did it, above all, by turning English ambition outward across the Channel toward a claim this series must introduce carefully. Through his mother, Edward held a genuine, if legally contestable, claim to the French throne itself, and in 1337, when the French crown passed instead to a cousin of the previous king, under a legal principle barring inheritance through the female line, Edward pressed his own claim by the oldest method available to any king in this whole series: war. The conflict that resulted would run, with truces and resumptions, for more than a century, long enough that history simply calls it the 100 Years' War. A name, this series notes in passing, that is at least an honest one. Unlike another, this part must handle more carefully later. The war's early decades belonged decisively to England, and the reason was a weapon this series has held in reserve as heavy texture since its own build began: The longbow, drawn from a stave of yew, standing as tall as the archer who used it, capable in a trained hand of loosing arrows with a force that could, under the right conditions of range, angle, and armor quality, pierce plate armor outright, or find the gaps and weaknesses a full harness could never quite eliminate, and, more devastatingly, of being loosed again and again in the time a crossbow needed to be wound once. The longbow was not a nobleman's weapon. It demanded years of practice from boyhood, a demand English law itself reinforced by requiring regular archery drill of the common freeman, so that England's armies could field, in a single formation, thousands of trained yeoman archers no continental army of the era could match in number or in rate of fire. At Crécy, in the year 1346, more than 6.5 centuries ago, Edward's smaller army, drawn up on a defensive slope with its archers massed on the flanks, met a much larger French force built around the armored, mounted nobility this series has watched define continental warfare since the conquest, and this series will tell the outcome plainly. Wave after wave of French cavalry, charging into a storm of arrows loosed faster than any crossbow or javelin could answer, broke against the English line without ever closing effective contact, and the battle ended in one of the most lopsided victories this series has yet had occasion to report. French losses running into the thousands against an English toll the chronicles describe as remarkably light. This series must state in the same breath what this victory meant beneath its own celebrated glamour, because Decision 4's honest ledger does not pause for a battle this famous. The archers who won Crécy were, in the overwhelming majority, common freemen, not knights. The battle's real lesson, learned slowly and imperfectly across the century that followed, was that a disciplined commoner with a bow could kill an armored nobleman who had spent a lifetime training for exactly the kind of combat the longbow was now making obsolete. A social as well as a military transformation this series will watch work its way, slowly, through the whole rest of this part's length. We may picture an English archer's morning before the battle, built from the equipment and training records this era left behind. He has strung his own bow, oiled against the damp, and checked a sheaf of arrows fletched the night before by hands as practiced as his own. He is not a knight and owns no armor beyond a padded coat, and if his village has prospered, a simple helmet, and his training began, as English law required of every able freeman, in the years before he could grow a proper beard, shooting at a village butt every Sunday after church until the draw of a war bow, a pull requiring, by modern estimate, a strength few unpracticed adults could sustain for even a single shot, let alone the dozen a minute a trained archer could manage, had reshaped his own skeleton, a deformation modern archaeologists can still identify in the buried bones of men who drew such bows across a lifetime. He takes his place on the flank in a line of his own village's men, and waits, and when the order comes, he will not stop drawing and loosing until his arms give out or the enemy breaks, whichever comes first. Crécy's glory did not translate into a settled peace. The war would run on, in phases of campaign and truce, for generations still to come, and this series will pick it up again once plague and revolt have had their own full say in the story. Rest a moment on the note this chapter opened with, because Part 3's whole shape depends on it. a crown lost to weakness and restored by conquest, a doctrine of sacred kingship already once broken by a parliament's own hand, and a weapon that has just demonstrated, on a French hillside, that the future of this island's wars might not belong to the armored few after all. What comes next tests this whole world more severely than any battle could. Death is coming, and it does not care whose hand can draw a bow. Chapter 2. The Death That Walked. This chapter carries the heaviest weight this series has yet asked a listener to sit with, and it will say so plainly at the door, exactly as its build promised. Grief without despair, a steady pace, and no invented horror, the record does not already supply in full measure. What arrived in England in the summer of 1348 needs no embellishment from this series or from anyone else. It is simply, by any honest reckoning, one of the deadliest events in the whole of human history. And this island did not escape it. The plague had been moving west for a year and more before it ever touched these shores, following the trade routes this whole series has occasionally glimpsed, running east toward the wider world. And it arrived, by most accounts, through a southern port in the summer of 1348, more than 6.5 centuries ago, and this series' hinge for the chapter, though it will not be a date this series lingers on, because what matters is not the calendar, but the speed of what followed. Within months, the sickness had spread across the whole of England, town and countryside alike, killing with a speed and a completeness the age had no vocabulary adequate to describe. Buboes swelling in the groin and armpit, fever and death within days for most who showed the signs at all. Moving through a household, a village, a monastery's whole close-packed community sometimes within a single week. This series will give the honest paragraph its full weight, and then move on, per its own oldest rule. Modern historians' best estimates place England's mortality somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population dead within roughly 18 months, a toll this series will not soften with qualification, because the qualification the sources themselves offer is only that some regions and some communities suffered even more completely than that average suggests, not less. The documented voices this series routes such catastrophe through are, in this instance, unusually direct, because English chroniclers of the period wrote through the plague's passage in real time, and their own bewilderment is itself part of the honest record. One monastic chronicler, describing the plague's arrival in his own community, wrote of monks dying so quickly that the living could barely bury them before more fell. Manorial records across the country show, in the flattest possible administrative language, entire villages' rolls of tenants struck through in a single year, replaced by the word dead repeated down a column where names had stood before. And the harvest of 1349 itself, this series notes as one of the plague's stranger cruelties, in many places rotted unharvested in the fields, because there were no longer hands enough left living to bring it in. We may picture a single manor village across the plague's passage, built from the parish and manorial records this era left in unusually granular detail. In the early summer, the village is at its ordinary work. The fields green, the manor court sitting to settle a boundary dispute exactly as such courts had sat for 2 centuries. When word arrives, weeks ahead of the sickness itself, that a town not far off has begun burying its dead faster than it can dig the graves. By late summer, the first deaths reach the village itself, and this series will not narrate the sickness's progress through any single household, beyond what the honest paragraph above has already stated. What the record allows, instead, is the aftermath, walked at a respectful distance. A harvest gathered, that autumn, by a fraction of the hands that had gathered the one before. A manor court, the following spring, recording vacant holdings by the dozen where tenant families had simply ceased to exist. And, in the years immediately following, something this series will name now because it is the chapter's genuine turn toward hope. Those tenants who had survived, suddenly scarce in a labor market that had, a generation before, always favored the lord over the laborer, beginning, village by village, to discover that scarcity was leverage. This series must trace that leverage honestly, because it is where Decision 4's promise of real, hopeful weight for villainage's partial unraveling is kept. With perhaps a third or more of England's labor force gone, the surviving peasantry found itself, for the first time in this whole series' length, able to demand higher wages, to abandon a manor for a better offer elsewhere, and to resist, in ways the pre-plague world would never have tolerated, the unfree obligations villainage had bound them to for centuries. The crown and the landed nobility, watching their own traditional advantage evaporate, responded with legislation, the Statute of Laborers, freezing wages at their pre-plague level and restricting laborers' freedom of movement by law. That this series will report honestly as an attempt to legislate the plague's economic consequences out of existence, an attempt that succeeded only partially and resentfully, and that set the stage directly for the eruption this chapter must now turn to. In 1381, a generation after the plague's first passage and following a further outbreak that had thinned the population again, a new poll tax, the third such levy in 4 years, falling with brutal evenness on rich and poor alike in a way earlier taxation had not, provided the spark for what historians call the Peasants' Revolt, though this series will note, in the same honest spirit that flagged Wars of the Roses for later correction, that the rising drew participants well beyond the peasantry alone. Artisans, small landholders, and disaffected townsmen swelled the ranks that marched on London under leaders including a man named Wat Tyler, whose demands, presented directly to the 14-year-old King Richard II at a meeting outside the city, ran to the heart of everything this chapter has traced: an end to villainage, fair rents, and free access to markets and labor without the old manorial restrictions. The revolt's immediate outcome, this series will report in outcome as it reports every rising. The young king met the rebels in person, made promises he had no intention of keeping once the crowd dispersed, and the revolt's leadership was hunted down and executed within weeks once royal authority had regathered its nerve. But the deeper current this series has traced across the whole chapter did not reverse with the executions. Villainage, weakened by the plague's economics years before the revolt, and unable to reassert its old completeness after it, continued its slow, uneven decline across the following century, not abolished by any single law this series can point to, but eroded, manor by manor, until it had largely ceased to structure English rural life by a point well within living memory of listeners of this series' own closing chapters. This chapter closes on the honest double truth its whole length has been building toward. The plague that killed, by the most careful modern estimates, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of everyone then living in England, was also, in the bitter economic logic this series has traced, without ever calling it anything but bitter. One of the most consequential blows this whole story has recorded against the unfree labor system this series has carried as a continuous burden since the Conqueror's own peace. Nothing in that logic redeems the deaths. This series will not let the one fact launder the other. Both are simply true, and this series has told them both, exactly as it promised at its own outset it always would. Rest now, if this chapter's weight asks it of you. The sea is quiet, and the worst is past. What comes next tests the crown itself one more time, in a deposition this series has been building toward since Edward II's own fall. Now delivered against a king, this series must introduce with considerably more sympathy than his fate will ultimately earn him. Chapter 3. A king deposed again. Richard II came to the throne at 10 years old, in the shadow of the Peasants' Revolt. His own boyhood presence had briefly, dramatically calmed, and this series must introduce him with real sympathy before it delivers the fall this chapter is named for, because the fall itself will make far more sense once the man is understood rather than simply judged. He grew into a king genuinely committed, by most accounts, to the sacred dignity of his own office. A believer, more explicitly than most kings this series has walked with, in the doctrine planted since this series' earliest chapters, that an anointed king ruled by God's own direct sanction, and that any noble who questioned his will questioned by extension God's own judgment. This series must note the irony plainly, because Richard's own reign will prove it in the hardest possible way. A king who believed most fervently in his crown's untouchable sanctity is the very king whose own nobility will touch it and remove it within 2 decades of his majority. The friction built across the 1380s and 1390s in a pattern this series has now traced twice, with Edward II's own fall as the clearest precedent. A king relying heavily on a narrow circle of favorites, a nobility increasingly resentful of exclusion from influence, and increasingly convinced their own ancient rights were being trampled by royal high-handedness, and a series of confrontations. A council of regency-minded lords briefly seizing control of government in Richard's minority. A period of vengeful royal reassertion once Richard came fully into his power, exiling or executing several of the very lords who had once curbed him, that escalated, by the century's final years, into open crisis. The immediate trigger in 1399 was characteristically personal and characteristically consequential. Richard, having already exiled his own cousin Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Lancaster, over a private quarrel, seized the whole of the exiled duke's vast inheritance upon his father's death, rather than let Bolingbroke succeed to it, as the law of inheritance every noble house in England depended on for its own security would ordinarily have guaranteed. Bolingbroke, landing in England that same summer nominally to reclaim only his own inheritance, found the country's nobility rallying to him so completely and so quickly that a mission of limited restitution became, within weeks, something considerably larger. This series will tell the deposition itself in outcome, at documented remove, because the chronicle sources for these exact weeks are unusually rich and unusually careful to construct, after the fact, a legal fiction this series must name plainly for what it was. Richard, captured and brought to London, was pressured into a formal public act of abdication. The chronicle record insists, with a thoroughness that itself suggests anxiety about the claim's own fragility, that he resigned the crown willingly of his own free choice, God's anointed surrendering his sacred office by his own hand, rather than having it torn from him by force. This series states plainly what the insistence itself reveals. A king had been deposed by armed rebellion, exactly as Edward II had been 72 years before him, and the whole elaborate ceremony of willing abdication existed to paper over the doctrine this series has tracked since Part 1, that an anointed king's authority came from God, and could not, in the strict theology of the age, simply be voted away by his own subjects, however justified their grievances. Richard died within months of his deposition, in captivity, in circumstances the chronicles again report with more confidence than the sources genuinely support. This series will note only that he died, and that his death removed the one obstacle that might have complicated Bolingbroke's own claim. Bolingbroke took the throne as Henry IV, and the fact deserves stating as plainly as any fact in this whole series has been stated, why his accession matters so much more than its own immediate drama suggests. Henry's claim to the crown was, by the strict rules of hereditary succession, this series has tracked since the Conqueror's own arguable claim, genuinely weaker than at least one other living descendant of Edward III. A rival line descended through a daughter rather than a son, but senior in strict seniority of descent, whose own claim Henry's usurpation simply set aside in favor of the sword he actually held. This series plants that fact here, deliberately, because it is the seed this whole part's final chapters will watch grow into open war, a Lancastrian line ruling by conquest and convenient legal argument rather than undisputed hereditary right, with a rival Yorkist claim, senior by blood, if not by possession, waiting in the genealogical background for the moment. Still decades off, but now inevitable in a way this series wants the listener to feel. When a weak enough Lancastrian king might finally give that rival claim its opening. Henry IV spent much of his own reign simply holding on to what he had taken. Against rebellions, this series will dissolve into the phrase they earn. A rebellious Welsh rising under Owain Glyndwr that briefly threatened to undo Edward I's whole conquest, and repeated baronial revolts from nobles who had helped him to the throne and now felt insufficiently rewarded for it. He held the crown until his own natural death. An achievement this series notes was not nothing, given the fate of the last two kings. This chapter and the last have described, and passed it to a son this series' next chapter will show doing something no English king had managed in generations. Winning, decisively and gloriously, a war across the Channel that had gone badly, on balance, for most of the century before him. This chapter closes on the doctrine this series has now watched crack twice in barely 70 years. Sacred, anointed kingship tested against the plain fact of two forced depositions in one lifetime span of English history, and papered over, both times, by exactly the kind of legal and ceremonial fiction this series has learned to name honestly rather than accept at face value. The crown survived both cracks. Whether it could survive a third, fought not between a king and his own barons, but between two branches of the same royal house, each claiming the same senior blood, is the question the rest of this part exists to answer. Rest a moment, if you like. One glorious chapter of conquest lies just ahead, before the roses this series' own title has promised finally, unavoidably, begin to bloom. Chapter 4. Agincourt and the Lost Crown of France. Henry V inherited, at 25, a throne his father had spent a reign simply holding on to, and did with it something this series must report as genuinely, historically remarkable before it delivers the honest reversal that follows. He revived, with a focus and a competence his predecessors across this whole century had rarely matched, the English claim to the French crown this series first raised back at the 100 Years' War's opening, and he pursued it not as a distraction from domestic trouble, but as the deliberate unifying project of an entire reign. The campaign's crest came at Agincourt in October 1415, more than 6 centuries ago, where an English army this series must describe honestly as considerably smaller and considerably more exhausted than the French force opposing it. Having marched for weeks through hostile territory on short rations and been reduced further by dysentery, found itself forced to battle on a narrow field between two woods, flanked by freshly plowed, autumn-soaked ground that would prove, this series notes, as the battle's genuine tactical key, far more punishing to heavily armored men advancing on foot than to the English archers massed once again, exactly as at Crécy 7 decades before, on the flanks. The French nobility, advancing in a dense, armored mass across ground their own weight was actively sinking them into, met the same storm of arrow fire this series described in Part 3's opening chapter, compounded now by exhaustion, mud, and the crush of their own numbers, pressing men who had fallen forward into ground too churned to let them rise again. The battle's outcome, by every surviving account, English or French, was catastrophically lopsided. French losses, including a devastating proportion of the kingdom's own high nobility, ran into the thousands, against an English toll the chronicles again describe as remarkably light. And Henry, in the campaign's aftermath, secured a treaty that did something no English king before him had ever achieved outright: recognition as heir to the French throne itself, to be united with the English crown in his own person upon the death of the reigning French king, sealed by Henry's marriage to that king's own daughter. This series must state plainly what made this triumph so fragile, because the whole of the rest of this chapter is the honest accounting of exactly how fragile. Henry V died in 1422, of dysentery contracted on campaign at not yet 36 years old, a mere 2 months, by the era's own cruel timing, before the French king whose throne he had been promised also died, meaning the infant Henry VI, not yet a year old, inherited, in a single stroke, the crowns of both England and France at once, a dual monarchy that was, from its very first day, a legal claim resting on an infant's cradle rather than on any army in the field. What followed, across the 1420s through the 1440s, this series will dissolve into the pattern its outline demands. A long, grinding, ultimately losing war to actually hold the French territories Henry V's treaty had promised. Prosecuted by regents and generals of real ability against a French resistance that found, in these same decades, the rallying figure and the revived royal legitimacy this series will name only briefly, because her fuller telling belongs to a different history than this one. A peasant girl from Lorraine, convinced of a divine mission to see the French king properly crowned, who broke the siege of Orléans and turned the war's whole momentum before her own capture and execution by the English side on charges of heresy in 1431. This series notes her honestly and moves on, because what this chapter must track is the English crown's own slow collapse, not the details of the French recovery that caused it. Territory won at Agincourt's cost bled away across 2 decades of costly, unsuccessful campaigning, until by the early 1450s, the English holdings in France had shrunk to almost nothing beyond the single port of Calais, the entire extraordinary inheritance Henry V had built, lost within 30 years by a son who had inherited his crown before he could walk. For Henry VI, grown to adulthood, proved to be this series' clearest instance yet of the danger this whole story has tracked since Edward II's own reign. A king personally pious, by most accounts gentle and genuinely devout, and almost entirely unsuited to the hard, ruthless business of holding a contested crown together, prone, by his own physician's documented accounts, to episodes of complete mental collapse that left him unresponsive for months at a stretch, unable even to recognize his own newborn son during one such episode, the chronicles describe with real pathos. A kingdom that had just watched a glorious French inheritance evaporate now found itself governed, in practice, by a shifting coalition of nobles contesting for influence over a king who could not, for long stretches, govern at all. And this series must now name, plainly, the rival whose own claim this whole part has been holding in reserve since Henry IV's usurpation. Richard, Duke of York, senior in strict hereditary descent from Edward III, increasingly convinced, as Henry VI's incapacity deepened and his own exclusion from influence sharpened, that the Lancastrian line's whole hold on the crown rested on nothing sturdier than 80 years of possession and convenient legal argument. This chapter closes on the crest and the unraveling both delivered in the same breath, because that is the honest shape of what actually happened. A young king who won, in a single afternoon's fighting on a muddy French field, more glory than any English monarch this series has yet described, and a son who lost every acre of it, and very nearly his own throne's stability besides, before he had reached an age to understand what either inheritance had cost. Rest a moment, if you like, before this series' own promised title finally, fully arrives. The crown has been fought over by barons, by a father and a rebellious son, by 2 cousins each claiming God's own sanction. It is about to be fought over, for the first time in this whole series, by 2 branches of one family, each wearing a rose, and neither willing to yield. Chapter 5. The Roses Divide. This chapter must open with the caution this series' own build promised to deliver directly, the first time its most famous phrase is used, exactly as prior editions of this project have named a horned helmet's later invention, or a Bushido code's Meiji-era construction, rather than let a comfortable myth stand unexamined. The conflict this chapter and the next must tell is universally known today as the Wars of the Roses, and this series will use that name, because there is no better one in common circulation. But it must say plainly, before using it even once more, that no one fighting this war ever called it that. The phrase does not appear in any contemporary chronicle. Its popularization traces substantially to a 19th-century novelist, drawing in turn on a scene from a 16th-century play written a full century after the fighting ended. For a Tudor audience with every political interest in presenting the conflict as a tidy, symbolically resolved tragedy, rather than the messy, protracted, often directionless series of coups, battles, and reversals it actually was. The play's own scene, rival nobles in a garden, plucking red and white roses from the bush to declare their allegiance on the spot, has no basis in any contemporary record, and was, by every indication, invented outright for dramatic effect. The badges themselves were real. The white rose genuinely associated with the House of York, the red rose with Lancaster, though the red rose's use before the war's very end is more sparse in the contemporary record than the tidy modern name implies. This series will use Wars of the Roses from here forward as the common, useful name it has become, while asking the listener to remember every time it appears that the tidiness is a later gift from storytellers, not a fact this war's own participants would have recognized. The war's opening did not arrive as a single declared conflict, but as an escalating series of confrontations this series will trace at the pace its outline demands. Richard, Duke of York, having failed to secure lasting influence over Henry VI's government through legal and political means across the early 1450s, took up arms in 1455, meeting a smaller royal force at St. Albans in what this series will treat as the war's true opening battle, more than 5.5 centuries ago. A skirmish by the scale of battles this series has described elsewhere in this part, but one that killed enough of the king's own household and closest advisers in the fighting through the town's own streets to make reconciliation between the factions considerably harder than it had been the week before. This series will dissolve the following 4 years' uneasy truces and renewed confrontations into the phrase they earn, and arrive at the moment the conflict hardened past any hope of settlement. In 1460, York pressed his own claim not merely to influence but to the crown itself, securing an agreement that he or his heirs would succeed Henry upon the king's death, disinheriting Henry's own son in the process. A settlement no queen mother watching her own child's birthright signed away could be expected to accept quietly. That queen was Margaret of Anjou, and this series seats her now with the full weight her own conduct across the following years earned her. French-born, married to Henry VI as a teenager in a match meant to seal a temporary peace with France, Margaret proved, once her husband's incapacity and her son's disinheritance forced her hand, to be one of the fiercest and most politically formidable figures this whole series has walked with, raising armies in her son's name, negotiating for foreign support with a directness the era's own chroniclers, uncomfortable with a woman wielding power this openly, frequently described in terms considerably harsher than they applied to any man doing the same. Within months of the disinheriting settlement, Lancastrian forces loyal to Margaret killed Richard of York himself at the Battle of Wakefield. His head, the chronicles report, displayed afterward wearing a paper crown in mockery of the throne he had claimed. A detail this series reports at the documented remove Rule F requires, neither embellished nor softened. York's own claim passed undiminished by his death to his eldest son. A young man this series' next chapter must introduce in full, who would within months turn his father's death into the very throne his father had only claimed. We may picture a noble household in these opening years of open war, choosing its allegiance the way every household in this conflict eventually had to. Built from the retaining records and personal letters this era left behind in real abundance. A minor lord, his own lands sitting inconveniently near the shifting line between Lancastrian and Yorkist strength, gathers his household in the Great Hall to weigh a decision that will determine not just his own fate, but his tenants and his sons. Which badge to wear, which lord summons to answer, knowing that the wrong choice, if the other side's fortunes turn, could cost the family its lands, its standing, and quite possibly its life within a single season. Letters survive from exactly such households, hedging, delaying, watching the news from the last battle before committing a single retainer either way. For this was not. This series must note plainly against the tidy garden scene image, a war fought by two clean, ideologically opposed sides, so much as a shifting, often opportunistic scramble of noble houses, recalculating their own advantage battle by battle. Exactly the kind of messiness the later, tidier legend was invented to smooth away. This chapter closes on the war's grim escalation rather than its resolution, because resolution belongs to the next chapter and to the single field this whole series has been walking toward since its very first Anglo-Saxon succession dispute. Richard of York is dead, his claim inherited by a son with every intention of pressing it to its logical conclusion. Margaret of Anjou has shown this series, and shown her own century, exactly how fiercely a mother can fight for a disinherited son's throne. And the crown, fought over now by cousin against cousin rather than baron against king, is closer than it has ever been in this whole story to changing hands by the oldest and bluntest method available to anyone who wants it badly enough. Rest a moment, if you like. The field at Bosworth is not yet in sight, but the road to it is now the only road this story has left to walk. Chapter 6. Bosworth Field. Richard of York's eldest son took the throne in 1461, within months of his father's death at Wakefield as Edward IV, and this series will compress the following 2 decades to the pace their own eventual irrelevance to this chapter's true ending earns them. A reign twice interrupted. Once by a brief Lancastrian restoration, this series will dissolve into a single sentence. Henry VI restored for less than a year before Edward's own return, and victory ended it for good, with Henry dying in the Tower shortly after under circumstances the chronicles, as ever, report with more confidence than the sources support, and Edward's own death in 1483, at not yet 41. Leaving the crown to a 12-year-old son, this chapter must now watch disappear from history entirely. Edward V reigned, if the word applies at all to a boy who was never crowned, for a little over 2 months, under the protection of his uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, appointed protector during the boy's minority, in the manner this series has watched royal minorities require since Henry VI's own infancy decades before. What happened next? This series must report with the full honesty its own contested sources demand, because this is one of the most disputed sequences of events in the whole of this series' length. Richard, within weeks of assuming the protectorship, had the young king and his younger brother declared illegitimate on grounds this series notes, without further comment. The era's own chroniclers found convenient rather than compelling, took the throne himself as Richard III, and had the 2 boys, the so-called princes in the Tower, lodged in the royal apartments there, where they were seen with diminishing frequency across the summer of 1483, and then, by every account that survives, not seen again. What became of them, this series states plainly, is not known with certainty to this day. The near universal assumption, both in their own time and since, is that they were murdered on Richard's own order or with his knowledge, a conclusion the balance of circumstantial evidence genuinely supports. But this series will not present as settled fact what remains, formally, an unsolved case, noting only that skeletal remains discovered in the tower in the 17th century, and long assumed to be theirs, have never been conclusively identified by modern forensic standards, and that the mystery itself has outlived every other detail of Richard's own brief, contested reign. Richard's seizure of the throne shattered whatever fragile Yorkist unity Edward IV's own reign had rebuilt, and drove a considerable number of disaffected Yorkist nobles into an alliance with the one remaining plausible Lancastrian claimant. This series has held in careful reserve since Henry IV's own usurpation opened this whole rival claim thread nearly a century earlier. Henry Tudor, a young nobleman whose own hereditary claim to the throne, traced through his mother, was, this series must state with the same bluntness it has applied to every contested claim in this chapter, genuinely thin, descended from an illegitimate line only later legitimized, and senior to several other living claimants by almost no measure except the accident of who was left standing and willing to fight. Henry, exiled in Brittany for most of his life, landed in Wales in August 1485 with a modest force of French mercenaries and English exiles, and marched to meet Richard's considerably larger royal army near the village of Market Bosworth in Leicestershire. This series will tell the battle itself in outcome, at the same restrained distance it has applied to every field of this whole story, because the fighting's own tactical details matter far less than what happened at its center. The battle turned, by most reconstructions, on the decision of 2 powerful noble contingents, commanded by a stepfather of Henry's own, whose loyalties had been carefully, ambiguously uncommitted for the whole of the preceding campaign, to hold back from the fighting until its outcome was no longer in serious doubt, and then to commit decisively against Richard rather than for him, in the same pattern of calculated, late-breaking allegiance this series' last chapter watched play out in noble households across the whole preceding war. Richard himself, seeing the battle turning against him, made a final, personal charge directly at Henry's own position. An act of real, desperate courage this series will report honestly alongside everything else it has reported of him, and was cut down in the fighting, becoming, in that single stroke, the last English king to die in battle, and the last king of the Plantagenet line this whole series has followed, since a Norman duke first claimed the throne more than 4 centuries earlier. Henry Tudor was crowned, by most accounts on the field itself or very shortly after, as Henry VII. This series must now deliver as plainly and as completely as it has delivered anything in its whole length. The answer this moment gives to the question this entire series has carried since its own very first Anglo-Saxon succession dispute. What makes a king legitimate? Henry's answer, and history's own answer through him, is the bluntest one available. His hereditary claim did not settle the matter. Plenty of English and Welsh nobles had, at one point or another in the preceding decades, a claim at least as strong. What settled it was a battlefield, exactly as it had been settled on this same soil more than 4 centuries before, when another claimant with an arguable case and an army behind it had simply won. Henry took the crown by right of conquest, precisely as William the Conqueror once had, and this series asks the listener to feel the whole of this story's shape close on that single symmetrical fact. It began with one conquest on English soil, and it ends with another. And then, because a crown taken by the sword alone rarely feels secure to the man wearing it, Henry did what every insecure claimant this series has ever described eventually attempts. He built the legitimacy the battlefield had not fully supplied. Within months of Bosworth, he married Elizabeth of York, eldest daughter of Edward IV, and this series seats her now as the women's thread's closing bookend, promised since this series' own build began. Elizabeth's own blood carried the senior Yorkist claim this whole war had been fought to defend. Her marriage to the new Lancastrian king united, about as literally as this series can offer the word, the 2 warring branches of Edward III's own line, Red Rose and White Rose, joined in a single royal marriage bed and commemorated within Henry's own reign in a new heraldic badge this series will let stand as its own closing image. The Tudor rose, red and white combined into one flower, worn by a dynasty that would rule England for more than a century after the battle that made it possible. This series closes its main narrative here, because nothing that follows changes the answer Bosworth has just delivered. The crown this whole series has followed since a chalk-down farmstead first came into view was never, across the whole of this story, quite as sacred or as settled as its own coronation liturgy always claimed. It was fought for, argued over, deposed twice by parliaments uneasy with their own theology, seized by conquest at both this story's beginning and its end, and finally, on an August morning in 1485, decided the way this series has now watched it decided more than once. By whoever held the field when the fighting stopped, and by whatever legitimacy could be married, argued, or written into being afterward. What survived that ending, and a great deal did, informs this series thinks the listener will find genuinely rewarding once the immediate weight of this chapter has had room to settle. Is the whole subject of the 2 chapters still ahead? Rest now, if this chapter's weight asks it of you. The rose has bloomed both colors at once, and the field is quiet. Chapter 7, Legacy 1. What Bosworth left behind. Every part of this whole project ends its main story at the crest, and then stays 2 chapters longer, because the crest, this format has learned across every history it has told, is never actually the point. What a world leaves behind is. Bosworth ended the Plantagenet line and answered, as bluntly as history ever answers anything, this series' oldest question about legitimate kingship. It did not end the institutions 7 centuries of English crown, castle, and council had built, and this chapter's whole task is to trace, honestly and without romance, what actually survived the field. Begin with the throne itself, and with how quickly its new occupant moved to secure what the sword alone had not fully guaranteed. Henry VII, having married Elizabeth of York within months of Bosworth exactly as the last chapter described, spent the following years hunting down and eliminating a series of pretenders and rival claimants with a thoroughness this series will note plainly rather than romanticize. The new Tudor dynasty was, in its first decade, considerably less secure than its own later, confident image ever let on, and Henry's own caution, his careful accumulation of the royal treasury, and his marriage alliances for his own children, were the tools of a man who understood, better than most kings this series has described, exactly how easily what he had won could be lost again. The institutions this series has watched develop across 7 centuries proved considerably more durable than any single dynasty. Parliament descended, however imperfectly and non-continuously, from the Anglo-Saxon Witan this series planted in Part 1, matured through the great councils of the Norman and Angevin kings, and given its decisive expansion of authority in the crisis years this whole part has walked through, when kings needed parliamentary consent for the taxation that funded wars in France and against pretenders alike. Continued under the Tudors essentially unbroken, its 2 houses of Lords and Commons already recognizably the institution a listener today would recognize by name, if not by every particular of its medieval procedure. English common law, which this series planted as superlative 2 all the way back in Henry II's own legal reforms, continued developing under Tudor rule and beyond, carried in the centuries following to every corner of an empire this series will not attempt to trace. So that today, this series can say plainly, common law forms the basis in whole or in substantial part of the legal systems of a very large portion of the world's nations. And Magna Carta, superlative 1 planted at Runnymede in Part 2, continued its own strange afterlife exactly as that chapter promised. Reissued, reinterpreted, and increasingly mythologized as a foundational charter of liberty by generations of lawyers and reformers who read into its specific, limited, baronial interest clauses a far grander principle than King John's own barons ever intended, until it became, centuries after Bosworth, one of the most cited constitutional documents in the history of law, genuinely foundational to that later principle, even though, as this series noted honestly at the time, its own immediate practical effect in 1215 was limited, and most of its specific provisions were revised or quietly dropped within a generation of its sealing. Now this series must turn to the caution its own build promised to deliver directly, exactly as it has named a horned helmet's later invention and a Bushido Code's Meiji-era construction in prior editions, rather than let a comfortable myth stand unexamined. One of the most consequential portraits of Richard III the world possesses. The physically deformed, murderous, scheming usurper of enduring popular imagination was not primarily the work of Richard's own contemporaries, many of whose accounts are considerably more measured, but of writers working a full generation and more after Bosworth, under a Tudor dynasty with every political incentive to blacken the man their own founder had killed to take the throne. A Tudor-era historian's account, itself drawing on sources of uncertain reliability written under the new regime, supplied much of the raw material. And a playwright working a full century after Bosworth, under Henry VII's own granddaughter Elizabeth, took that material and shaped it, for the London stage, into the vivid, spine-curved, murderous villain whose lines are still performed today, and whose face is still, for most of the world, the only face Richard III has ever worn. This series states plainly what modern historians broadly agree on. The real Richard was neither the saint, his most devoted modern defenders sometimes claim, nor the cartoon villain the stage gave the world. A capable administrator and soldier by most contemporary accounts. And very probably, on the balance of evidence, this series weighed honestly in the last chapter, complicit in his own nephew's deaths, but a figure considerably more human and considerably less theatrically evil than 5 centuries of retelling have made him. This series will let both truths stand together, exactly as it has let every contested figure in this whole series stand. The propaganda was real, it worked spectacularly and durably, and the man underneath it remains, in the details that matter most, genuinely uncertain. We may picture, briefly, one of the institutions this series has tracked continuously since well before Bosworth, still standing in this evening's own present tense. The universities at Oxford and Cambridge, already centuries old by the time Henry Tudor's army crossed into Wales, continued training the lawyers, clergy, and administrators who staffed both church and crown throughout the medieval period. This series has walked, their halls and quadrangles, in real and substantial part, physically continuous with buildings this series' own kings would have recognized. A present-tense fact this series offers without embellishment, because a thing that has simply continued, quietly, for the better part of a millennium, needs no embellishment to earn its weight. What remains is memory, aesthetic, and myth. 3 things this format has learned, across every history it has told, are never quite the same as history itself, and never quite separate from it either. The final chapter must weigh all 3 honestly, close the myth versus ground questions this series has carried since Arthur was first flagged as legend, and walk the listener home. Rest a moment more, if you like. One chapter remains, and it ends, as this whole series always promised it would, with 2 roses becoming 1. Chapter 8. Legacy 2. The Crown and the Rose. So we come to the last chapter, and as always in this project, the last chapter is not about what happened, because nothing more happens. It is about what remained, and the walk home. There is no rush, tonight least of all. The story is told. The channel is quiet. What is left is the accounting and the goodbye. Begin by closing the questions this series opened and deliberately left standing, because a listener who has walked this whole way deserves to know, plainly, where the ground gives out and the memory begins. Arthur, flagged as legend in this series' second chapter and never mentioned again in the main narrative, remains exactly what this series left him. A figure who may echo a real sub-Roman British war leader resisting the earliest Anglo-Saxon settlement, wrapped across centuries of retelling in a chivalric castle and round table splendor that belongs entirely to a much later medieval imagination, projecting itself backward onto a period that could not, in genuine historical fact, have looked anything like it. Robin Hood, never fully named in this series' main chapters but implicit in every Forest Edge mention of outlawry this story has made, is a similar case this series will now close plainly. No single historical outlaw has ever been convincingly identified as his original, and the ballads that first carried his name emerged, in the form the world now recognizes, considerably later than the Richard the Lionheart and Wicked Prince. John setting popular tradition eventually gave him a folk hero assembled, like so much of this series' most beloved material, from pieces considerably more scattered and considerably less tidy than the legend now suggests. And Richard III's own real remains, which this series held in reserve for exactly this closing chapter, deliver one of the most remarkable present-tense payoffs this whole project has ever had the pleasure of reporting. In 2012, archaeologists excavating beneath a municipal car park in the city of Leicester, built unknowingly over the site of a friary church demolished centuries before, uncovered a skeleton showing severe scoliosis of the spine and multiple wounds consistent with battlefield death, and DNA analysis comparing the remains to living descendants of Richard's own family line confirmed, to a very high degree of confidence, that this series' own contested king had been found, at last, under a parking lot, 527 years after Bosworth. He was reburied in 2015 with full royal ceremony in Leicester Cathedral, a genuinely moving present tense close to a mystery this series has carried honestly since Chapter 6, and a reminder that this whole story's ground is not always as buried as it seems. Now the present tense more broadly, the payments this series has banked all the way through, due now in full. The Tower of London still stands on the Thames, its White Tower core substantially the same stone the Conqueror's own builders raised. Westminster Abbey still crowns English monarchs today, in a ceremony incorporating elements this series watched take shape across the very centuries it has just walked through. A surviving original of Magna Carta remains on public display, one of history's most limited baronial charters transformed, by 6 centuries of reinterpretation, into one of the most cited constitutional documents in the world. Parliament, descended however imperfectly from the Witan this series planted in its very first part, still sits at Westminster, its 2 houses still doing, in recognizable form, the work this series watched take shape at Runnymede and in the crisis-driven councils of the century that followed. And the Tudor rose, red and white combined, the image this series chose to close its main narrative on, remains, to this day, a recognized royal badge of the country this whole series has just finished walking across. And now the ritual, for every history in this project ends with a walk, back through its 4 companions, in their fixed order, gathering the whole journey as it goes. And this one asks the listener to walk from the chalk downs where this series opened, past a castle, to the Channel shore where this whole island's story has always, eventually, returned. We may picture it, the last reconstruction, built from a country the listener could visit tomorrow. Start high, on the chalk downland, where this series' very first farming family once watched the seasons turn, long before any king had claimed this ground. This is the Isle, first of the four companions, closing the story exactly as it opened it. A land unusually whole, unusually free of the mountain ranges and island fractures that divided other stories this project has told. Which is why, across 7 centuries of usurpation, civil war, and disputed succession, this story kept circling back to a single crown rather than dissolving, as those other stories did, into 100 permanent fragments. The land made one kingdom possible. It never once in this whole series' length made one kingdom easy. Down from the downs, the path passes as it must, beneath the walls of a castle, weathered stone, its ditches grassed over now, open to visitors who climb its keep for the view rather than its garrison. And here, third of the 4 companions, though this series asks the listener to take the motifs slightly out of their earlier order for the walk's own natural geography, stands the castle. The conqueror's answer to a conquered land, carried through every siege of the Anarchy, every Welsh and Scottish campaign, every Wars of the Roses battle this series has described. Brick and stone standing in for the whole argument about who actually controls this ground. The castle this listener is passing today controls nothing anymore. It simply remains, exactly as this series' closing chapters always promised the strongest things in this story eventually would. At the foot of the down, where the fields open toward the coast road, take the crown with you the last stretch, not as a weapon or even quite as an office, but as the argument this whole series has actually been having with itself since its very first Anglo-Saxon succession dispute. What makes a ruler legitimate? This series watched that argument answered by blood, by conquest, by parliamentary deposition, by marriage, and finally, at Bosworth, by the sword alone, dressed up afterward in whatever legitimacy could be married or written into being once the fighting stopped. The crown that rules this country today traces its own line. However tangled by marriage and consent and constitutional reform across the centuries since, back through the Tudor rows this series closed its main story on, all the way to the field where an anointed king died and an unlikely conqueror picked up what he had dropped. And here, before the final headland, the path reaches the Channel, fourth and last of this series' companions, the narrow water that brought the legions, brought the Anglo-Saxons, brought the Vikings this series compressed, and a companion series told in full, brought the Normans who would not be absorbed the way the earlier invaders had been, and carried the Angevin kings back and forth to an empire that stretched, for over a century, further into France than any English king would ever again control. The Channel is quiet this evening, the way it is quiet most evenings. Gulls work in the tide line, a ferry's wake dissolving slowly into the gray water. And this series asks the listener to remember, standing here, that this same narrow crossing decided more of this story than any single battle did. Not because the water connected everything the way Greece's sea once did, and not because it isolated everything the way Japan's once did, but because it did both, unpredictably, at the moments of its own choosing, for the whole of this story's length. So let the journey set itself down, softly, the way the light is going down over the water. The isle which made one crown possible, the castle which held it, however briefly, in stone. The crown, fought over, deposed, married, and finally won by the plainest method history ever offers, and the channel which brought every stranger this story ever had to reckon with, and asked nothing in return but to be crossed. A farming family once watched a season turn on this same chalk. A Roman villa's hippocaust went cold for the last time. A monk copied Bede's own history by candlelight. A shield wall held for a long autumn day, and then did not. A king sealed a charter at a water meadow because his own barons left him no other road. An archer drew a bow that would deform his own bones for the rest of his life. A village buried more of its own dead in 1 year than in the 20 before it combined. And a rose, finally, at the end of everything, bloomed both colors at once. None of it had to happen this way. All of it began with chalk, water, and a channel too narrow to keep the world out for long, and a people who spent the better part of 1,000 years arguing, sometimes with words and far too often with swords, about who got to wear the crown that sat the whole time on land steady enough to hold one. The story of medieval England is told. Thank you for walking it. Every down, every castle, every battlefield and council chamber, all the way down to this shore. Whatever brought you here tonight, rest or wonder, or the old human need for a voice by the fire, may you have found it, and may you carry something of this stubborn, quarrelsome, unexpectedly enduring crown with you into the morning. Sleep now, if sleep is near. The isle is at your back. The tide is turning, gently, the way it always has. And somewhere behind you, in a quiet cathedral, a king found under a car park rests, at last, exactly where he should.